Welcome to the Nightmare Vault. Before we start, drop a hello in the comments, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Let's begin. You never really know your neighbors, do you? I mean, we all have this idea that suburbs are these safe little bubbles where everyone's just living their normal lives behind their normal doors. Mowing lawns on Sundays, having barbecues in summer, that whole picture-perfect thing. That's what I thought about Cherry Lane when I first moved there. Just your average street in a quiet suburb outside Manchester. Decent houses, nice gardens, the occasional kid's bike left on a front lawn. Nothing special, nothing that would make you look twice. I bought my house there about 4 years ago after getting a job at the local university's IT department. Nothing fancy, just network security and maintenance. The kind of job where people only notice you when something stops working. The house was a decent semi-detached. Previous owners had done it up nice enough that I didn't have to worry about major renovations. Perfect for a single guy who'd rather spend his weekends gaming than fixing leaky pipes. The neighbors seemed friendly enough at first. There was this older couple next door who'd bring in my bins when I forgot. A family with teenagers across the street. A few young professionals like me scattered around. Everyone smiled and waved, but kept to themselves for the most part. Perfect for me, since I've never been the block party type. I remember thinking it was weird how quiet the street was at night, even on weekends. Most suburbs have at least some noise. Teenagers hanging out, the occasional party, cars coming and going. But Cherry Lane was different. After about 9 p.m., it was like someone had hit a mute button. No cars driving through, no voices, sometimes not even the sound of a TV through an open window in summer. I just figured I'd gotten lucky. Found a street full of early-to-bed types who respected the peace and quiet. The first thing that struck me as odd, and honestly, I ignored it at the time, was the internet setup. Being an IT guy, I naturally checked out the network infrastructure when I moved in. The whole street had this insanely good fiber connection, way better than you'd expect for a suburb this far from the city center. I mean, we're talking enterprise-level speeds. When I asked the installation guy about it, he just shrugged and made a vague comment about the area being part of a special regional upgrade. I didn't question it, just felt lucky to have such good bandwidth for my gaming sessions. It was about 6 months in when I started noticing other strange things, little inconsistencies that didn't quite add up, like how the houses all had these high-end security systems, not just alarms, but proper CCTV, motion sensors, the works. Strange for a neighborhood with practically zero crime. Or how almost everyone had blackout blinds or curtains that were always closed after dark. Or the way certain houses would have visitors only at specific times, never random drop-ins, always scheduled, always the same pattern. Being a bit of a nerd with too much time on my hands, I started keeping track of these patterns, just out of curiosity, you know. The family across the street, for instance, every Tuesday and Friday, they'd have visitors arrive precisely at 10 p.m. The visitors always parked around the corner, rather than directly outside. They'd stay for exactly 2 hours, then leave. Same routine, week after week. The house 3 doors down had a different schedule. Mondays and Thursdays, visitors between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. The older couple next door, Wednesdays, weekends off. It was like watching some bizarre shift rotation at a factory, except this was a residential street. I probably would have just written it off as some weird suburban swinger thing, or maybe a gambling circle, if it hadn't been for what happened with my Wi-Fi. Being in network security, I regularly scan my home network for intrusions or unusual activity. Just professional paranoia, I guess. One night, I noticed something strange. Massive data uploads happening at regular intervals, not from my devices, but somehow passing through a hidden node on my network. Someone had piggybacked onto my system, but in a way that was incredibly sophisticated. They weren't just stealing my Wi-Fi. They'd actually created a secondary network that was using my connection as one of multiple routes. It was brilliant, technically speaking, routing data through several houses to mask the origin point, the kind of setup that would take serious expertise and coordination. My professional curiosity got the better of me, and I did something I probably shouldn't have. I set up a packet sniffer to see what kind of data was being transmitted. I expected to find evidence of some boring corporate espionage, or maybe someone running an illegal file-sharing operation. It took me a few days to accept what I was seeing. The houses on Cherry Lane weren't just homes. They were broadcasting studios for the darkest corner of the internet. Red rooms, where people would pay to watch unspeakable things happen in real time. Each house had its own schedule, its own specialty, its own audience, and they were all connected through an elaborate network designed to hide the source of the broadcast from anyone investigating. I should have gone to the police immediately. That's what any normal person would have done. But two things held me back. First, I technically committed a crime by hacking into this network, and second, I had no actual proof of what was happening inside those houses. I'd seen the data, but not the content. For all I knew, I could have been misinterpreting everything. So I decided to gather more evidence. I set up a hidden camera, pointing out my front window, recording the comings and goings on the street. I kept logs of network activity, noted patterns of when broadcasts seemed to be happening. I even started taking evening walks around the neighborhood, trying to glimpse anything through windows or hear anything that might confirm my suspicions. That was my first mistake, showing interest. In a neighborhood built around secrecy, someone suddenly paying attention stands out like a spotlight in darkness. About 2 weeks into my amateur investigation, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere on Cherry Lane. The neighbors stopped waving or making small talk. Cars I didn't recognize would drive slowly past my house at odd hours. My bins would be searched before collection day, items moved around or taken. Small things that could be explained away but added up to a clear message. I was being watched. Then came the digital warnings. My personal account started showing login attempts from unknown locations. My home security system would report offline status despite being fully functional. Anonymous emails would arrive with no content, except my current location or a photo of me taken earlier that day without my knowledge. I was being hunted by people who knew exactly how to disappear others. The turning point came when I returned home one evening to find my front door unlocked. I knew for certain I'd locked it. I always triple-checked. Inside, nothing seemed obviously disturbed, but a network scan revealed a new device connected to my Wi-Fi. A small camera hidden in my living room, smoke detector. They'd been inside my house, studying me, assessing the threat I posed. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, back against the wall, laptop open in front of me as I frantically compiled all my evidence onto an encrypted drive. The plan was simple. Leave at dawn, drive straight to a police station in another city, hand everything over, and disappear. Whatever was happening on Cherry Lane was bigger than me, more organized than I'd initially thought. As I worked, a notification popped up on my network monitor. Unusual activity on the street's shared infrastructure. Data rates spiking across multiple houses simultaneously, outside their normal broadcasting schedules. This had never happened before. All the houses were active at once, like some coordinated event. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as another notification appeared. Someone was accessing my home network, not from outside, but from one of my own devices. The camera in the smoke detector had been activated remotely. I was being watched right now as I prepared my escape. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It contained only a link, an onion address, accessible only through Tor browsers. Against every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, to grab my keys and run, I clicked the link. It opened to a streaming page with multiple camera views, all showing different angles of my house. My front door, back garden, the street outside, and most terrifyingly, my living room. Me, sitting there with my laptop, watching myself on the screen. In the corner of the page was a countdown timer, 003000, ticking down second by second. Below it, a viewer count rapidly climbing into the hundreds, and a comment section filling with messages in multiple languages. The title of the stream, displayed across the top of the page, turned my blood to ice. It announced a Cherry Lane special event focused on eliminating a security threat, with viewer participation enabled. This wasn't just surveillance, it was entertainment. I had been marked not just for removal, but for broadcast. The quiet, ordinary houses of Cherry Lane had synchronized their operations for a special feature presentation, and I was to be the unwilling star. I slammed my laptop shut, grabbed my car keys and the encrypted drive, and made for the front door. As my hand touched the knob, every light in my house suddenly went out. Not just electric lights. My phone died simultaneously, my smartwatch, everything electronic. An EMP device, professional grade, taking out everything with a circuit in a 10-meter radius. In the perfect darkness, I heard multiple cars pulling up outside, car doors opening and closing with soft, deliberate clicks. Footsteps on gravel, approaching from both directions. The sound of my back door lock being expertly picked. They were efficient, I'll give them that. They knew exactly how to control the situation, how to minimize noise and struggle. I fought anyway, managed to injure at least 2 of them, before something pricked my neck, and the world began to dissolve around me. I woke up in a room I didn't recognize, yet somehow knew intimately from its dimensions and design. One of the broadcasting rooms I'd never seen but had tracked through network data. The encrypted drive was gone. My clothes had been changed. Monitoring equipment had been attached to my chest and head. To capture vital signs for the viewers, I realized with detached horror. A high-end camera sat on a tripod in the corner, its red light glowing steadily. On the wall, a monitor displayed the same streaming page I'd seen earlier, now showing me in this room from multiple angles. The viewer count had reached thousands. The comment section scrolled too fast to read, but I caught disturbing suggestions about starting with fingers and saving the face for last among the less translatable comments. In that moment, I understood the true horror of Cherry Lane. It wasn't just that some neighbors were running red rooms. It was that the entire street was a coordinated operation. Everyone was involved, from the elderly couple who'd helped with my bins to the family with teenagers across the street. The quiet suburb wasn't a collection of independent households who happened to be engaged in similar activities. It was a purpose-built broadcasting facility disguised as a normal neighborhood. They'd created an entire fake community, with each house serving a specific role in both the operation and the maintenance of the facade. Some houses were broadcasting studios, others were for technical support. others for security and surveillance. They'd even planted fake normal residents, like the older couple, to make the street appear more authentic to outsiders and new targets. And I hadn't stumbled into this by accident. My background in IT security, my living alone, my clean record and minimal social connections. I'd been selected, researched, and maneuvered into buying that specific house. They'd wanted someone with technical skills to maintain their network infrastructure, someone who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. I wasn't their first victim. I was their newest employee, expected to work until I became content. The door opened, and 3 of my neighbors entered, people I'd waved to, made small talk with, believed were just ordinary people living ordinary lives. They wore surgical masks and gloves, and one carried a case that opened to reveal medical tools arranged with meticulous precision. The last thing I remember clearly was one of them adjusting the camera angle while explaining to the viewers that tonight's broadcast would demonstrate the consequences of curiosity, teaching a lesson about why some doors should remain closed and some networks left unexplored. I'm only able to tell this story because I escaped. Not that night, but months later, after I'd been broken, after I'd been forced to participate in what happened in those houses, after I'd learned every technical aspect of their operation. I got out during a power outage caused by a winter storm, the only time their redundant systems all failed simultaneously. I took nothing except knowledge of what happens on streets like Cherry Lane. I live differently now, in a small apartment in a crowded city centre. I have no internet connection, no smart devices, nothing that connects to anything else. I change locations every few weeks, pay only in cash, use a different name each time. I write this on paper, transferring it by memory to a public computer that I will never use again. Because Cherry Lane wasn't unique, it was one of many. Their network data revealed connections to similar operations across the country, across Europe, a whole hidden infrastructure of ordinary-looking streets, where extraordinary horrors unfold behind drawn curtains. Streets designed to look normal from the outside, while hosting the most profitable form of entertainment for those with the darkest appetites and the deepest pockets. Sometimes, when I walk through residential areas, I find myself studying the houses, looking for the signs I now recognize all too well. The uniformity of security systems, the pattern of visitor arrivals, the quality of the internet infrastructure, the silence after dark. And sometimes I see a street that matches all the criteria, where every house has blackout blinds that close at sunset, where the residents move with the hyper-awareness of people who know they're always on camera, where normal neighborhood randomness has been replaced by choreographed ordinariness. When I find those streets, I keep walking and never look back. Because the most terrifying thing about places like Cherry Lane isn't what happens inside those houses. It's how ordinary they appear from the outside, how effectively they hide in plain sight, and how many of them exist in quiet suburbs just like yours. So I've never actually told anyone this story before. Not fully anyway. It's been eating away at me for months, and I guess I need to get it out somehow. Just bear with me if I need to pause sometimes. It all started last November. You know how those dark winter nights in Bristol get? I was in this phase where I'd become weirdly obsessed with exploring the dark web. Nothing too crazy at first, just curiosity really. We all hear those stories, right? Urban legends about what's supposedly lurking in those hidden corners of the internet. I just wanted to see for myself. God, I was so naive. I'd spend most nights after work just browsing through these forums and marketplaces, telling myself I was just being an internet anthropologist or some pretentious rubbish like that. The rain would be hammering against my window, and I'd be hunched over my laptop with this weird blue glow on my face, just scrolling and scrolling. I started recognizing usernames after a while, started following specific threads. You know how it goes. You tell yourself you're just looking, but you're getting pulled deeper with every click. There was this one user, Void Watcher they called themselves, who I'd see moderating a bunch of different forums. Seemed knowledgeable, intelligent. After a few weeks of seeing their comments, I stupidly felt like I knew them, like we had some kind of connection. Looking back now, it's so obvious they were grooming me, dropping these little personal details here and there that made me trust them. Classic manipulation, but I couldn't see it then. This one night, God, I remember the rain was absolutely hammering down. Void Watcher messages me directly, says there's this new streaming site that's pushing boundaries, and offers to send me a private link. I hesitated for maybe 5 seconds. There was this, this little voice saying, maybe this isn't such a good idea. But I'd convinced myself I was being careful, using a VPN, keeping anonymous, just observing, not participating. What was the harm in looking? That question, it just haunts me now, What was the harm in looking? The link just led to this bare bones page with a countdown timer. Nothing else, just white text on black. Stream begins 47:16. I remember thinking it was a bit weird, but also kind of intriguing. Void Watcher messaged again saying it was an exclusive first viewing of something completely authentic. When I asked what exactly I'd be watching, they just said, real fear, real consequences, no actors, no scripts. I should have just shut everything down right then, should have deleted my browsers, formatted my hard drive, walked away. Instead, and I'm not proud of this, I made a cup of tea, wrapped myself in this old blanket I had, and just waited. Convinced myself I could always disconnect if things got too intense. When the stream finally started, it was just nothing. An empty van interior, dark grey carpet on the walls, single overhead light, weird camera angle. Nothing happened for like 10 minutes, and I nearly convinced myself it was some art project or someone's idea of a joke. I was literally about to message Void Watcher when I saw movement. A door opened. Light flooded in for a second, then slammed shut. 2 figures were manhandling this third person who looked completely out of it. There was no sound, which made it even more disturbing. Just this silent struggle as they forced this person into the van and tied them up. My heart was racing. I was sweating. This didn't look fake. The movements were too frantic, too desperate. I should have closed the window, should have reported it. Instead, I just sat there frozen, telling myself it had to be some elaborate roleplay thing, even though deep down I just knew it wasn't. Then the camera angle suddenly changed, getting all jerky and unstable. It took me a minute to understand what I was seeing. They'd attached the camera to the person they'd grabbed. I was seeing everything from their perspective now, all the panicked movements as they struggled against whatever was holding them. That's when it hit me. It was some kind of collar or harness with a camera mounted on it. They turned this person into nothing but a walking viewpoint, just an object carrying a camera for people like me to watch through. Text appeared at the bottom indicating viewpoint activation and bidding commencement. A counter showed 19 viewers, then 23, then 31. Another counter was showing what had to be cryptocurrency values just climbing higher and higher. That's when it fully hit me. This wasn't just some illegal content or whatever. This was, God, it's still hard to say it. It was a live stream where people were bidding to control what happened to this person. I was watching someone who'd been reduced to just content. Their terror packaged up for people hiding behind anonymous connections. My hands were just hovering over my keyboard. Should I call the police? But what would I even say? How could I explain without getting myself in trouble? And where was this even happening? Could have been anywhere in the world. The van had nothing distinctive about it. The camera view went wild as they yanked the person to their feet. For just a second, they faced what looked like a mirror in the van, and I caught a glimpse of their face, young, maybe early 20s, with this crude device strapped around their neck. Their eyes, Christ, their eyes were just terror, pure terror. That split second of eye contact, even through all that technology and distance, it just cut through everything. This was real. This was happening right now to a real person. The bidding counter went crazy as they positioned the victim in the middle of the van. I could only see parts of the other people, gloved hands, dark jacket sleeve, lower half of a face behind a mask. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. By watching, I was part of this. My viewership was being counted. Text flashed across the screen announcing the completion of the first auction. Then these instructions appeared, just cold and clinical, detailing what would happen next based on the winning bid. I won't repeat what was written, what they were planning to do, what they wanted us to see through the eyes of someone who knew they were going to die. That's when the feed suddenly went still. The frantic movement stopped. The victim just froze, and the only movement was their rapid breathing causing tiny vibrations in the image. The silence in my flat was absolute. I hadn't even noticed the rain had stopped. In that awful stillness, I finally snapped out of it and slammed my laptop shut. I was shaking all over. Ran to the bathroom and threw up until there was nothing left. Sat on the bathroom floor for I don't know how long, trying to figure out what to do. Call the police. But what evidence did I have? How would I explain how I found that stream? After about an hour, I convinced myself I had to report it, whatever happened to me. I opened my laptop, ready to take screenshots, gather whatever information I could. But the stream was gone. The link went nowhere. My messages with Void Watcher had disappeared, like none of it had ever happened, except for the images burned into my brain and this crushing weight of having watched without doing anything. For weeks afterwards, I jumped at every notification, changed my locks, covered my webcam, spent nights wondering if someone had noted my presence on that stream, if they'd identified me somehow. But nothing happened. No police, no mysterious figures following me. Just life continuing like nothing had changed, when everything had. Sometimes I wonder if what I saw was real or some elaborate hoax, but then I remember those eyes in that brief reflection, that raw fear that no actor could fake, and I know. I haven't been back on the dark web, scrubbed my devices, changed all my habits, but the knowledge is still there, that beneath all our normal internet stuff, there are these places where people become nothing but content, where watching makes you part of it. The scariest part wasn't even what I saw in that van. It was realizing how easily I'd been led there, how quickly curiosity becomes complicity, and knowing that somewhere those streams are still happening, those vans are still parked somewhere, those cameras are still being strapped to people who disappear without anyone looking for them in the right places. Because who would know where to look? And who would admit to having seen them there? Sometimes I wake up and for a second, I think I'm wearing that collar, that people are watching through my eyes, waiting to bid. I don't think I'll ever feel truly alone again. This is not exactly something you bring up at dinner parties, but I need to get it out of my system somehow, so, well, here goes. Last summer, I was working as a freelance photographer in London, mostly corporate headshots and property listings for estate agents. Nothing glamorous, just steady work to pay the bills. I've been doing this specialized architectural photography for high-end properties, and I guess my portfolio had started making the rounds in certain circles. So this email comes through on a Tuesday morning while I'm nursing a hangover and desperately trying to meet a deadline. The offer was, well, it was ridiculous really. $5,000 for a single evening's work, photographing a penthouse apartment in Knightsbridge before some exclusive private event. The catch was I couldn't share or publish the photos anywhere. They were strictly for the owner's personal collection, and I had to sign this extensive NDA before even getting the address. Looking back now, there were so many red flags. But when you're staring at your bank balance wondering how you're going to make rent, $5,000 might as well be a lifeline thrown from heaven. I convinced myself it was probably just some Russian oligarch or Saudi prince who wanted discretion. You hear about those types all the time in London property circles, people who pay obscene amounts for privacy. The NDA was intimidating, all dense legal language about confidentiality and severe consequences for breaches. I skimmed it, if I'm being honest. Another red flag I ignored. I was just focused on that payment, which they promised would be transferred immediately after the job. The address turned out to be this ultra-modern glass tower near the river. You know the type, those buildings that look like they're made entirely of mirrors reflecting the city back on itself. The penthouse took up the entire top floor. I remember the lift needed a special key card, which the concierge provided after checking my name against some list. The moment I stepped into that penthouse, I felt, I don't know how to describe it exactly, like walking into a space that wasn't quite connected to the normal world. The place was immaculate, all white marble, glass walls, and these massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking London. But there was something clinical about it, unlived in, like a stage set rather than a home. My contact was this woman in her 40s, expensively dressed, but in that understated way that actually cost more than flashy. She walked me through what they needed, primarily shots of the main entertaining space before guests arrived for their private club event later that evening. She mentioned it was an exclusive members-only affair and that I needed to be finished and gone by 8 p.m. sharp. I got to work, setting up my equipment and taking test shots. The main room was enormous, with this circular arrangement of white leather sofas in the center facing inward. Weird layout for a living space, but I figured it was arranged that way for the event. There were these strange metal fixtures on the walls and ceiling that I assumed were for lighting or art installations. While I was working, staff kept coming in and out, setting up for the evening. They all wore these identical black outfits with no logos or identifying features. None of them spoke to me or even acknowledged my presence, just moved around me like I was furniture. About an hour in, I needed to use the toilet. The woman pointed me down a hallway, and I took a wrong turn, opening a door to what I thought was the bathroom. Instead, I found myself in some kind of control room. There were monitors showing different angles of the main room I'd been photographing, plus other rooms in the penthouse I hadn't seen yet. Before I could process what I was looking at, someone firmly grabbed my shoulder and steered me back into the hallway, pointing to the correct door without saying a word. I remember standing in that pristine bathroom, staring at my reflection, telling myself there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a security setup for high-profile guests, or perhaps the owner was paranoid about staff stealing. I splashed water on my face and decided to finish the job as quickly as possible. The atmosphere was making me increasingly uncomfortable. When I returned to the main room, they were testing some lighting setups. The circular arrangement of sofas was now illuminated from above, creating this stage-like effect, with the center space brightly lit while the seating remained in shadow. It looked less like a social gathering setup and more like a viewing area. The woman came back to check on my progress and must have noticed me staring at the equipment, because she smoothly explained that they had a doctor on standby for all events, as many of their members were older. Made sense, I told myself. Just responsible hosting for wealthy clients. As I was packing up my gear, I realized I'd left a lens filter in one of the bedrooms I'd photographed earlier. I headed down a different hallway than before and opened what I thought was the right door. Instead, I found myself in a room that looked like a cross between a medical supply storage and a film studio. There were cameras on tripods, lights, more of that medical equipment, and these metal restraints attached to what looked like some kind of examination table. My stomach dropped. I suddenly felt ice cold despite the summer heat. Before I could back out, I noticed a laptop open on a desk, its screen showing what was unmistakably a dark web browser. Something I'd only ever read about but recognized from news articles. And on the screen was a payment page with astronomical figures next to usernames. I quietly closed the door and practically ran back to the main room, grabbing my stuff without checking if I had everything. I needed to get out of there. Now the woman seemed to materialize out of nowhere, asking if I'd gotten everything I needed. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak properly. She handed me an envelope, saying the transfer would be processed as agreed, but this was a bonus for my discretion. As I waited for the lift, clutching my camera bag, I noticed more people arriving. Wealthy-looking individuals in expensive suits and evening wear being checked against a list before being allowed up. Not one of them looked at me or each other. There was no warmth, no social greeting you'd expect from club members. Just this focused anticipation that made my skin crawl. The lift finally arrived, and as the doors were closing, I locked eyes with a young woman being escorted by two men in those same black outfits. She looked vacant, like she wasn't fully present. The men gripped her elbows in a way that didn't look supportive but controlling. Just before the doors shut completely, I swear I saw a flicker of panic cross her face, a silent plea that haunts me still. I got home somehow, though I barely remember the journey. My hands were shaking so badly, I could hardly get my key in the door. When I finally managed to open the envelope, there was £5,000 in cash and a note thanking me for my service to the circle, with a website address, an onion link for the dark web. Curiosity battled with dread that night as I paced my flat, the envelope sitting on my table like a live grenade. Eventually, I did something I'm not proud of. I downloaded a Tor browser and entered the link. What I found was a countdown timer and a membership fee that was more money than I'd make in 3 years. The page described an exclusive viewing experience for those with refined tastes and displayed blurred preview images that made me physically sick when I realized what they were suggesting. I shut my laptop and vomited in my kitchen sink. Those people weren't arriving for a sex club. It was a viewing party, a live audience for something unspeakable happening to real people. And I had helped them, photographed their space, made it look perfect for their marketing materials or membership site or whatever hellish purpose those images would serve. I spent the night alternating between panic and rationalization. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions. Maybe it was just some extreme but consensual thing for the super rich. But I kept seeing that young woman's face in the lift, the vacant look, the flash of fear. By morning, I'd convinced myself I needed to report what I'd seen. But report what exactly? I had no concrete evidence of anything illegal, just suspicions and glimpses of things that disturbed me. And that NDA I'd signed, the penalties suddenly seemed much more ominous than the simple financial damages. I tried calling the building management company to ask about the penthouse, only to be told no such unit existed at that address. When I insisted, describing the woman who'd hired me, they said they had no record of such a person and suggested I might have the wrong building. 3 days later, my entire portfolio website disappeared. Every cloud backup I had was wiped. My professional social media accounts vanished. It was as if my career had been erased overnight. When I called my web host in a panic, they told me the takedown had been executed with a legal order they couldn't discuss. A week after that, I was evicted from my flat. The landlord claimed to have received complaints about illegal activity, though he wouldn't specify what kind. My bank account was frozen pending an investigation into unspecified financial irregularities. The message was clear. I'd seen something I shouldn't have, and these people had the power to dismantle my life without leaving fingerprints. I left London that night, staying with a cousin in Manchester, while trying to figure out what to do. I've moved twice more since then, changed my name, abandoned photography completely. I work in a warehouse now, cash in hand. I don't have social media, a credit card, or a permanent address. I look over my shoulder constantly, flinching whenever I see anyone in a black outfit or a luxury car slowing down near me. Sometimes I wonder if I overreacted, if I imagined the connections between what I saw. But then I remember the equipment, the setup of that room, the woman in the lift, and I know I didn't. I've read enough since then to understand what a red room is, a place where people pay to watch torture, and worse, in real time, on the dark web. Most of them are considered urban legends, but I saw one being prepared. I know they exist. The worst part? I still have those photographs on a memory card I can't bring myself to destroy. It's the only evidence I have that I didn't imagine the whole thing. But it's also the thing that could get me killed if they ever found out I kept it. So I keep moving, keep looking over my shoulder, keep wondering how many other penthouses there are in how many other glass towers, where the wealthy gather behind closed doors to watch unspeakable things happen to people who disappear without anyone looking in the right places. Because who would know where to look? And who would believe it even if they saw it? What haunts me most isn't what I might have seen if I'd stayed. It's knowing that while I'm talking to you right now, somewhere in some gleaming penthouse with a view, those sofas are arranged in a circle, those lights are focused on someone's pain, and people are paying to watch, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. I've been trying to make sense of what happened for weeks now, sorting through the details, trying to figure out which parts were real and which were something else. I still wake up in cold sweats, checking my wrists for marks that have long since faded. It started because I was broke, properly, desperately broke. My flatmate had moved out without warning, leaving me with double rent in East London that I couldn't possibly afford on my uni stipend. I'd been picking up odd jobs online, transcription work, user testing, those survey sites that pay pennies. anything to avoid calling my parents and admitting I couldn't hack it on my own. That's when I found this posting on one of those gig economy sites I'd been trawling. The description was vague but intriguing. Something about participating in an immersive live performance project with minimal acting experience required. The pay was ridiculous, £500 for what they described as a single 8-hour session. When I applied, not expecting much, I received an almost immediate response asking if I was comfortable with being filmed and with simulated scenarios of intensity. I remember laughing to myself about how sketchy it sounded, but also thinking it was probably just some art student's experimental film or a marketing stunt for a horror movie, the kind of thing that would make a good story later. They asked for a photo of myself and some basic measurements. Looking back, I realized they were assessing whether I'd fit whatever look they needed, whether I'd be believable on camera. After agreeing to their terms, I received coordinates to a storage facility on the outskirts of London, along with a specific unit number and a time, 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. The late hour should have been another warning sign, but they explained it as necessary for the aesthetic they were trying to achieve. I figured it was just filmmaker types being precious about their vision, the kind who think everything looks better at night. I remember the journey there vividly, taking the tube to its furthest stop, then a bus that came only once an hour, then walking the final mile down unlit roads with only my phone torch to guide me. The storage facility was one of those modern ones, all gleaming metal and keypad entries, but eerily deserted at that hour. The only sounds were the distant hum of the North Circular and the occasional security light clicking on as I passed. Using the code they'd sent, I let myself through the main gate. The facility was massive, rows and rows of identical units stretching in every direction. I followed the numbered signs until I found the one I'd been directed to. It looked exactly like all the others, a roll-up metal door with a keypad lock. I punched in the code I'd been given, half expecting it not to work, half hoping it wouldn't. A note on the table instructed me to sit and wait, explaining that the scenario would begin shortly and that I should react naturally to whatever happened. It emphasized that everything was staged and that I could end the simulation at any time by saying a specific phrase, something like "Emerald System Shutdown" or similar industry jargon. I remember thinking it was all very dramatic, but also kind of exciting in a strange way, like I was in on some secret project. I sat in the chair, noticing for the first time that there were small cameras mounted in the corners of the unit. The laptop on the table was open but locked. I waited for about 20 minutes, checking my phone occasionally, wondering if I'd been stood up or if this was all some elaborate prank. Just as I was considering leaving, the laptop screen suddenly came to life. It displayed what looked like a streaming interface, very bare bones, with a simple chat window on the side and a counter showing the number of viewers. The number was climbing rapidly: 23, 47, 89, 156. I realized with growing unease that whatever was about to happen was being broadcast somewhere. The chat was filling with messages in various languages, many containing Bitcoin amounts and what looked like bids. This definitely wasn't some student film project. Before I could process what I was seeing, the storage unit door rattled violently. 2 figures in dark clothes and balaclavas rushed in. It happened so fast. One moment I was alone. The next I was being forced to the ground, my hands zip-tied behind my back. I tried to remember the safe word, but panic had erased it from my mind. I kept telling myself this was the performance, that this was what I'd signed up for. The roughness felt realistic, but surely that was just good acting. One of them set up something on a tripod, another camera, more professional than the small ones in the corners. The other dragged the mattress to the center of the room, positioning it directly in front of the laptop so that whoever was watching would have a clear view. They moved me onto the mattress, and that's when the first seed of real doubt crept in. The zip ties were cutting into my wrists, drawing blood. That seemed extreme for a simulation. When I tried to speak, to ask if this was part of the scenario, one of them pressed duct tape roughly over my mouth. I could see the laptop screen from where I lay. The viewer count now in the hundreds. The chat scrolling too fast to read. There was a moment of clarity when I realized that whatever line had existed between performance and reality had blurred beyond recognition. These people weren't actors. Or if they had started as actors, the scenario had evolved into something else. The panic must have shown in my eyes because one of them leaned in close and whispered that this was all part of the experience, that I was doing great, that the audience was loving my authentic fear. I tried to convince myself they were right, that this was all elaborately staged, that the blood I could feel trickling from my wrists was somehow fake. But then one of them pulled out a knife, a hunting knife with a serrated edge, not a prop, and began cutting away my clothes. The cold metal against my skin felt undeniably real. The goosebumps that rose weren't performance. The laptop chimed repeatedly as the bits in the chat increased. I could see usernames and amounts flashing by as people paid to watch, to suggest what should happen next. The performing arts project facade had completely fallen away, replaced by the sickening realization that I was the unwitting star of some dark web live stream. A stream where the audience didn't just watch, but directed the action through their payments. One of the figures checked the laptop periodically, nodding to the other as if receiving instructions. They set up additional lights, positioned to eliminate any shadows that might hide what was happening from the viewers. There was a methodical professionalism to their movements that terrified me more than if they'd been frenzied or emotional. This was routine for them. I wasn't their first. The hours that followed exist in my memory as fragments, moments of excruciating clarity punctuated by merciful periods of dissociation, where I seemed to float above my own body, watching what was happening to someone else. I remember the cold concrete floor against my back, the laptop chimes marking increased bids, the clinical way they responded to the highest paying viewers' requests, the way they occasionally tilted the camera to better capture my reactions. What haunts me most is the uncertainty that lingers even now. At some point during that endless night, they removed the duct tape and started asking me questions, increasingly personal ones, about my fears, my limits, my pain threshold. When I begged them to stop, they insisted this was all part of the performance, that I was doing brilliantly, that the audience could tell the difference between real fear and acting. They kept reassuring me that everything was under control, that I was completely safe. And sometimes, in their gentler moments, I almost believed them. When they gave me water, when they checked that the zip ties weren't cutting off circulation, when they explained what would happen next, as if walking an actor through a scene. Those moments of apparent concern made everything more confusing. Were parts of this real and others staged? Was I actually in danger? Or was this an extreme form of immersive theatre that I'd simply misunderstood? Near what I think was morning, though with no windows, it was impossible to tell. The stream seemed to reach some sort of conclusion. The viewer count had dropped significantly. One of them checked the laptop one last time before closing it. They removed the zip ties, handed me a bundle of clothes that weren't mine, and told me I'd done well. They counted out cash, the full £500 plus what they called a performance bonus, and placed it on the table. Then they simply left. No explanations, no debrief, nothing to definitively tell me whether what I'd experienced was real violence or elaborate theatre. Just instructions not to leave for 20 minutes, and a reminder that I'd signed an NDA prohibiting me from discussing the project with anyone. I sat there in the empty storage unit, pulling on the oversized clothes with shaking hands, trying to make sense of what had happened. The cameras were still there in the corners. I wondered if they were still recording, if someone was watching me try to reassemble myself. I took the money. I still don't know why. Maybe as evidence that it happened at all. The journey home is a blur. I remember sunlight hurting my eyes as I emerged from the storage facility. I remember people on the tube staring at my disheveled appearance, the clothes that didn't fit, the visible marks on my wrists and neck. I remember the overwhelming urge to tell someone, anyone, what had happened, but being unable to find the words. How do you explain something when you yourself don't understand what was real? In the days that followed, I searched for the website I'd seen on the laptop screen. I trawled the dark web using tutorials I found online, looking for any trace of the stream, for my own face among the videos for sale. I found nothing conclusive, just similar streams that made me physically ill to glimpse, never knowing if I was among them. I reported nothing to the police. What would I say? That I voluntarily went to a storage unit in the middle of the night for money? That I wasn't sure if I'd been assaulted or had participated in extreme performance art? That I took the payment and left without seeking help? They'd either dismiss me or worse, investigate and find the NDA I'd signed, the messages where I'd agreed to participate in simulated scenarios of intensity. The storage unit company had no record of the unit number I provided when I called anonymously to ask about it. According to their system, that particular unit had been empty for months. The gig posting had disappeared from the website where I'd found it. The email address I'd communicated with bounced back all my messages. Sometimes I almost convinced myself it was all an elaborate production, some extreme form of immersive theatre or a psychological experiment. The fact that they paid me, that they didn't keep me there or do lasting physical damage, suggests boundaries existed. But then I look at the scars on my wrists, the nightmares that wake me screaming, and I know something genuinely traumatic happened in that storage unit. The worst part is the uncertainty, the not knowing which parts were performance and which were real, whether the audience was watching fiction or genuine torture, whether I was a victim or a performer who simply hadn't understood the role. I check my bank account obsessively now, looking for unexpected deposits that might indicate my continued unwitting participation in something I don't understand. I've covered every camera on every device I own. I've moved flats, changed my phone number, deleted all my social media. But I still feel watched, still wonder if somewhere, on some corner of the dark web, people are bidding for a sequel. After all, they know where to find me. They know what I look like, and they know I need the money. Every time I pass a storage facility now, I wonder how many units contain people like me. People caught in that terrible space between performance and reality, never knowing if their fear is entertainment or evidence. I sometimes find myself staring at my laptop screen in the dark, finger hovering over the power button, afraid of what might be waiting for me online. It's been 3 years since it happened, but the images still flash behind my eyelids whenever I close them for too long. The sounds still echo when my flat gets too quiet. The knowledge of what exists in those hidden corners of the internet still weighs on me like a physical presence. I just moved to Manchester for a teaching position that had fallen through at the last minute. My savings were dwindling. My laptop had died an inglorious death after an unfortunate encounter with a cup of tea, and I was staying in this miserable bedsit where the Wi-Fi worked about as reliably as British weather forecasts. I needed to send out CVs, check job listings, anything to keep myself from having to crawl back home to Birmingham and admit defeat. That's how I found myself in this grimy internet cafe, tucked between a kebab shop and a betting parlor on a side street that even Google Maps seemed hesitant to acknowledge. The kind of place with ancient desktop computers behind sticky partitions, mysterious stains on the carpet, and a permanent haze of cigarette smoke despite the no smoking signs plastered everywhere. The kind of place that charged by the hour, but would look the other way if you wanted to download something dodgy, or watch something that might raise eyebrows in a more reputable establishment. I remember the owner barely looking up when I walked in, just pointing to an open computer in the far corner and grunting what might have been a price. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of teenagers huddled around a screen playing some online game, and an older man with bloodshot eyes staring intently at his monitor. The computer I was assigned was tucked away in the corner, partially hidden by a partition that might once have been white but had yellowed to the color of nicotine. The chair wobbled, the keyboard was missing several keys, and there was a peculiar smell emanating from somewhere beneath the desk that I chose not to investigate. But it had internet access, and at that point, that was all that mattered. I spent the first hour doing what I'd come to do, sending emails, updating my CV, applying for jobs that I was either overqualified or underqualified for, but desperate enough to try anyway. It was mind-numbing work, made worse by the sluggish internet connection and the computer that seemed to deliberate over every keystroke like it was making a life-altering decision. After a while, I needed a break. The teenagers had left, the bloodshot-eyed man was still there, and the owner appeared to be dozing behind the counter. I decided to check some news sites, maybe scroll through social media for a bit before diving back into the job hunt. That's when I noticed something odd. When I opened a new browser window, it didn't default to the usual search engine. Instead, it opened to a blank page with a simple search bar and a string of numbers and letters in the address bar that didn't look like any URL I'd seen before. I figured it was some custom setup for the cafe, maybe a portal page or something. Out of curiosity, I tried searching for general news. The results that came back weren't from any sites I recognized. The layouts were basic, the text sometimes oddly formatted. Some weren't even in English, but the content seemed legitimate enough. World events, political commentary, technology news, just from sources I'd never heard of. I remember thinking it was interesting how different search engines could yield such different results. I clicked on a few links, skimming articles that seemed to have more detailed information than mainstream sites, sometimes with perspectives that felt refreshingly unfiltered. One link led to another, and I found myself on what looked like a forum discussing internet privacy and surveillance. The users seemed knowledgeable, if paranoid, sharing tips on how to avoid tracking and discussing the extent of government monitoring programs. It was while reading through these discussions that I first saw mention of something called the Red Rooms. The way they referenced it, always with a mixture of disgust and morbid fascination, made it clear this was something deeply disturbing. My initial instinct was to back away, to return to the job sites and forget about it. But there's something insidious about curiosity when it's paired with the perceived anonymity of being on someone else's computer in a place where no one knows your name. I searched for the term, telling myself it was just to understand what they were talking about, just to confirm it was as bad as I suspected, so I could properly condemn it. The search returned fewer results, and they were much darker in tone. Links with ominous names, descriptions that were deliberately vague, yet hinted at violence. Still, nothing explicit appeared, just discussions, rumors, debates about whether such things actually existed or were just internet legends designed to frighten the naive. One thread caught my attention. Users were arguing about the authenticity of various sites, with some claiming most were elaborate hoaxes designed to scam the gullible or trap the unwary. One user, with the username Lucky Number 7, seemed particularly adamant that they had verified access to legitimate streams. They were being challenged by others accused of boasting about something they couldn't prove. In response, Lucky Number 7 posted what appeared to be access instructions, a URL that wasn't clickable, instructions for a specific browser, references to encryption keys and verification processes. It read like a deliberately complex treasure map, designed to filter out all but the most determined. The post was quickly deleted by a moderator, but not before others had responded with variations of disbelief and macabre interest. I sat there, staring at the screen where the post had been, feeling an uncomfortable mixture of relief and disappointment that it had disappeared before I could properly process it. I should have taken that as a sign to stop, to get back to my job search, to remember why I was there in the first place. Instead, I found myself scrolling back through the cached version of the page, looking for fragments of those instructions. I told myself it was just to understand, just to know what people were talking about, just to confirm it was real, so I could properly process how disturbed I should be. Justifications that sound hollow now, but seemed reasonable in that moment. I found bits and pieces, enough to piece together that these red rooms were supposedly live streams of torture or worse, where viewers could pay to request specific acts. Most users insisted they were myths, technical impossibilities, or elaborate scams. But the user Lucky Number 7 had seemed so certain, had written with such specific detail. In my fumbling exploration, I clicked through to a page that asked for a verification code. I was about to back out when I noticed the username displayed in the corner of the screen. Lucky Number 7. I wasn't on my own account. I was somehow logged in as this person. The previous user must have forgotten to log out, and the cafe hadn't properly reset the browser. A chill ran through me as I realized what this meant. The computer I was using belonged to someone actively involved in these dark corners of the web, someone who might return at any moment, someone who might not appreciate me using their account, seeing their activities. I should have left immediately. I should have paid for my time and walked out, maybe even warned the owner about what was happening on his computers. Instead, I froze, staring at that verification prompt, the cursor blinking expectantly in the empty field. What happened next is difficult to explain, even to myself. I entered a number. Not randomly. I typed 7 because of the username. A simple, stupid impulse based on nothing but pattern recognition. I expected an error, a security question, anything that would block my accidental intrusion. Instead, the page loaded. The screen went black momentarily, then filled with thumbnail images arranged in a grid. Each had a title, a price, and a small counter showing viewer numbers. The titles were clinical, descriptive in the way scientific classifications are descriptive. Detached language that barely concealed the horror they represented. I remember feeling numb, disconnected from my own body as I stared at those thumbnails, like I was floating somewhere above myself, watching someone else's hands hover over that keyboard, someone else's eyes scan those images. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. One of the thumbnails was highlighted, indicating it was currently live. Without consciously deciding to, I found myself clicking on it. There was a brief loading screen, a payment prompt that seemed to recognize lucky number 7 as having credit, and then I won't describe what I saw, not specifically, not the room or the equipment or the people, not the fact that it was happening in real time, that a counter in the corner was ticking up as more viewers joined, that a chat window was filling with requests and amounts attached to them, not the moment when I realized the person controlling the camera had acknowledged a request from lucky number 7's account, from me, as far as they were concerned, and was acting on it. I slammed the laptop shut so hard the screen cracked. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short gasps that didn't seem to bring any oxygen with them. The owner looked up at the noise, his expression changing from annoyance to concern when he saw my face. I must have looked like I was having a heart attack. I threw money on the counter, too much probably, and stumbled out into the street, gulping the polluted city air like it was the purest mountain breeze compared to the suffocating knowledge of what I'd just witnessed, what I'd just inadvertently participated in. I walked for hours, trying to outpace the images in my head, the implications of what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it had been fake, staged, an elaborate production designed to fool the gullible. But I knew, something in me knew with cold certainty, that what I had witnessed was real suffering, real people, real money-changing hands to perpetuate it, and I had been part of it. However accidentally, however briefly, I had been counted among the viewers. My borrowed identity had made a request that had been fulfilled. Someone had suffered because of a number I typed without thinking. I never went back to that internet cafe. I spent money I didn't have on a new laptop the next day, using the public library's Wi-Fi until it arrived. I considered reporting what I'd seen to the police, but couldn't figure out how to explain it without implicating myself. What would I say? That I'd stumbled upon torture broadcasts while casually browsing the dark web? That I had used someone else's account to access them? That I had, however unintentionally, participated? In the end, I did nothing, said nothing, tried to forget what I'd seen and move on with my life. I found a job eventually, moved to a better flat, rebuilt some semblance of normality. But sometimes, my new laptop will freeze for a moment, or a website will take too long to load, and I'll feel that same cold dread washing over me. The fear that somehow I've stumbled back into that hidden world, that lucky number 7 has found me, that those unseen observers who monitor such things have tracked me down and are watching, waiting to see if I'll reveal what I know. Because the thing that haunts me most isn't just the horror I witnessed, it's the knowledge that it continues, with or without me watching. That right now, as I'm telling you this, as you're sitting there listening, somewhere those streams are still running, somewhere people are still paying to watch, somewhere lucky number 7 is still making requests, and somewhere the people who run those streams are still wondering who was using that account on that specific day, who saw what they weren't supposed to see, who knows what they aren't supposed to know. I check over my shoulder more often these days. I use VPNs, encrypted messaging, anonymous browsing, not because I'm doing anything wrong, but because I'm T. I used to think I was lucky to find that flat, Coventry isn't exactly known for affordable housing with decent views, but somehow I'd managed to secure a one-bedroom on the 9th floor of Blackthorn Heights for less than the going rate. The letting agent mentioned something about the building's transitional phase and how they were trying to cultivate the right community atmosphere. At the time, I just nodded along, mentally calculating how much I'd save compared to my previous place. The building itself was one of those structures that seems to exist in every British city. Built in the late 70s, briefly fashionable, then sliding into disrepair before being regenerated, with a fresh coat of paint and some potted plants in the lobby. 22 floors of identical windows stacked in a perfect grid, the kind of place where you could live for years without ever knowing your neighbors. I moved in during that strange liminal week between Christmas and New Year's, when the world feels suspended in time. The corridors were eerily quiet as I carried my boxes up from the moving van. I remember being struck by how clean everything was. No scuff marks on the walls, no lingering cooking smells, none of the usual signs of human habitation you'd expect in a building housing hundreds of people. My flat was perfectly adequate. Open-plan kitchen and living area. Bedroom just large enough for my double bed. Bathroom with surprisingly good water pressure. The previous tenant had left it immaculate, which should have been a relief, but somehow felt unsettling, like all traces of their existence had been methodically erased. The first couple of weeks passed uneventfully as I settled into a routine. I'd leave for work at 8 a.m., return around 6 p.m., occasionally glimpsing other residents in the lifts or lobby. Everyone kept to themselves, offering nothing more than a brief nod if our eyes happened to meet. I initially chalked it up to typical British reserve, perhaps amplified by urban living. It was the silence that first struck me as odd. I'd lived in flats before and was accustomed to the ambient soundtrack of shared living. Muffled conversations, television sounds bleeding through walls, footsteps overhead. But Blackthorn Heights existed in a perpetual state of hushed quiet, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Then came the first peculiarity that I couldn't simply rationalize away. I was returning home late one Friday night, slightly tipsy from after-work drinks, when the lift stopped at the 13th floor. This confused me momentarily, as I distinctly remembered the building jumping from 12 to 14, like many high-rises do because of superstition. Yet here was the number 13, illuminated on the panel. When the doors opened, I was struck by the difference in atmosphere. The corridor looked similar in layout, but was finished to a noticeably higher standard. Recessed lighting instead of fluorescence, what appeared to be actual hardwood flooring rather than laminate. Walls painted a deep burgundy instead of the institutional cream on my floor. Before I could process this properly, a man in a dark suit entered, nodded curtly, and stood with his back to me. The doors closed, and we continued upward in silence. I convinced myself I'd been mistaken about the floor numbering, that I'd simply never noticed the 13th floor before. But the following morning, I checked as I descended in the lift, and sure enough, the buttons jumped from 12 to 14. The 13th floor button was simply absent. I might have dismissed the whole thing as alcohol-induced confusion, if not for what happened the following week. Unable to sleep one night, I decided to take out my rubbish, more as an excuse to walk around than out of necessity. The building had a chute on each floor, but sometimes larger items needed to be taken to the basement facilities. The basement was deserted, lit by flickering fluorescence that created moving shadows in the corners. As I was depositing my rubbish, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before, partially hidden behind the recycling bins. It was unmarked except for a small black symbol that resembled a stylized eye or perhaps a keyhole. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tried the handle. To my surprise, it opened onto a stairwell I didn't recognize, narrower than the main stairs, with metal steps rather than concrete. Something about it felt wrong, private, not meant for residents, but I'd already come this far. I climbed the stairs, trying to minimize the metallic echoes of my footsteps. After what seemed like more flights than should have been necessary to reach the ground floor, I emerged into yet another corridor I didn't recognize. This one was utilitarian, almost industrial, exposed pipes running along the ceiling, numbered doors with electronic card readers beside each one. I was disoriented, unsure what part of the building I was in. As I stood there debating whether to continue exploring or return the way I'd come, one of the doors opened further down the hallway. Instinctively, I ducked into an alcove, suddenly certain I wasn't supposed to be there. Through the narrow gap between the wall and a large electrical panel, I watched as two men exited the room. They were dressed casually, but carried themselves with a deliberate alertness that made me think of security personnel. One was speaking in hushed tones about resolution issues and frame rates, while the other nodded, checking something on a tablet. They walked past my hiding spot without noticing me, disappearing through a door at the end of the corridor. I waited several minutes before moving, heart pounding against my ribs. When I was certain they weren't returning, I crept toward the door they'd emerged from, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The door had been left slightly ajar. Through the crack, I could see what appeared to be a monitoring station. Multiple screens showing different rooms, each one meticulously furnished, but in vastly different styles. One looked like a vintage 1970s lounge, another like a sterile medical examination room, a third like a child's nursery, all empty, all waiting. On a desk beneath the screens sat several high-end cameras, lighting equipment, and what looked like a control panel with dozens of switches and dials. A laptop was open beside them, displaying what I recognized with a sudden chill as a dark web browser interface, similar to ones I'd seen in documentaries about internet crime. The screen showed a payment system, usernames, and viewing statistics for something called the Blackthorn Experience. I backed away, trying to process what I was seeing. It looked like some kind of broadcasting setup, but the secrecy, the dark web interface, it suggested something deeply illegal. I needed to leave, to pretend I'd never seen any of this. I turned to retrace my steps and found myself face to face with a woman I hadn't heard approach. She was impeccably dressed in what looked like an expensive business suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and asked if I was lost. Her tone was pleasant, but carried an undercurrent of steel. I mumbled something about taking a wrong turn while looking for the maintenance office, trying to mask my terror with confusion. At the stairwell door, she asked my flat number and name. I was too frightened to consider lying. She smiled again, thanked me for my understanding, and watched as I descended the stairs. I felt her eyes on my back long after I turned the corner. The next day, I received a letter under my door informing me of a rent decrease due to my valued resident status. It was a substantial reduction, enough to make me hesitate before acting on what I'd discovered. I told myself I needed time to think, to plan my next move carefully. That evening, I noticed a subtle change in my flat. Nothing I could definitively point to. Perhaps items moved slightly from where I'd left them, a different smell in the air, a sense that the space had been occupied in my absence. I began checking for hidden cameras, growing increasingly paranoid about being watched. I started researching Blackthorn Heights online, looking for anything unusual associated with the building. Most results were standard property listings and bland corporate information about the management company. But on the 7th page of search results, I found a single forum post from 3 years earlier. Someone claiming to be a former maintenance worker described accidentally discovering a studio setup in the building and subsequently being offered a significant raise to forget what they'd seen. The post had no replies and had been made by a now deleted account. That night, unable to sleep, I stood at my window staring at the identical grid of windows across from mine. Most were dark at this hour, but I counted 11 that remained illuminated despite the late hour. As I watched, the lights in one flat suddenly brightened dramatically, as if powerful studio lights had been switched on. The blinds were open, allowing me to see directly inside. What I witnessed in that flat across the courtyard made me recoil from the window. My hand clamped over my mouth to stifle a scream. I won't describe it in detail. I'll just say that what occurred in that brightly lit space was being done by one person to another. It was clearly not consensual, and it ended with stillness, with absence of movement where movement should have been. When my hand stopped shaking enough to hold my phone, I dialed emergency services. I reported what I'd seen as clearly as I could, providing the building name and what I estimated to be the flat number based on its position. The operator assured me police would be dispatched immediately. 20 minutes later, 2 officers arrived at the building. I watched from my window as they entered, then waited anxiously for any sign of activity. After about 15 minutes, they emerged and returned to their car without any apparent urgency. No additional police arrived, no ambulances, no forensic teams. My phone rang an hour later. The caller ID showed only private number. It was the woman from the restricted area, her voice just as pleasantly chilling as before. She thanked me for my concern about my neighbor, but assured me the police had found nothing amiss. The flat in question was currently unoccupied according to their records. She suggested that the stress of city living sometimes played tricks on the mind and reminded me of the mental health resources available to residents. Before ending the call, she mentioned how fortunate I was to have such an affordable flat in the current market. The threat was clear. I spent the remainder of the night researching other accommodation, preparing to leave first thing in the morning. But when I tried to access my bank account online, I found it temporarily frozen due to suspicious activity. My emails to my family and close friends about staying with them were bouncing back undelivered. When I tried to call out, my phone showed no service despite full signal bars. 3 days later, I remained in the flat, watching the windows across from mine with obsessive attention. I've documented everything I've observed. Lights activating in different flats at regular intervals, the same terrible scenes playing out in different rooms with different people. Always at night, always brightly lit, always ending the same way. I've come to understand that Blackthorn Heights isn't just a building. It's a carefully constructed broadcasting network. Each flat potentially a stage. Each resident either a knowing participant or an unwitting neighbor like myself. The dark website I glimpsed must be offering live streams of real murders to paying viewers around the world, each occurring in carefully designed sets that exist behind ordinary-looking doors in this very ordinary-looking building. Why am I telling you this now? Because last night, I saw them preparing the flat directly opposite mine, replacing the furniture, setting up additional lighting, positioning cameras behind ordinary-looking wall fixtures. This morning, I received another letter under my door, a notice about scheduled maintenance requiring access to my flat tomorrow evening, and a reminder of my special resident status and the importance of community cooperation. I'm typing this on my phone with the battery nearly dead. I've tried knocking on neighbors' doors, but no one answers. The main entrance is now staffed by security guards I don't recognize, who politely but firmly turn away any visitors. The lifts require key card access that my card no longer provides, limiting me to my floor and the lobby. If you're reading this, it means I found a way to get this message out. It means I'm probably no longer in a position to tell you what happened next. But if you ever find yourself being offered an unusually affordable flat in a high-rise where the residents keep to themselves, where certain floors seem to exist only sometimes, where the management is overly interested in your movements, run. Because somewhere right now, someone is watching a live stream from Blackthorn Heights. Someone is paying to watch what happens in these rooms. And tomorrow, someone will be watching my flat, waiting for the show to begin. This sounds strange. I know it does. But I still taste chalk dust whenever it rains. That particular mineral staleness that catches in the back of your throat, mixing with the damp. 7 months have passed since I escaped Greenwood Academy, but my body remembers everything my mind tries desperately to forget. I used to be a substitute teacher, covering sick days and maternity leaves across different schools in Leeds. Not the career I'd dreamed of, but it paid the bills while I worked on my novel in the evenings. The irony doesn't escape me that I finally have a story worth telling, but I can barely bring myself to type a single word of it. It was mid-January when I got the call about Greenwood, a last-minute booking for a week-long cover at a private school on the outskirts of the city. The agency mentioned it had recently changed ownership and was transitioning between terms, whatever that meant. The pay was substantially better than my usual rate, enough to cover a month's rent in a single week. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. Greenwood sat isolated at the end of a long, tree-lined drive, the kind of imposing Victorian building that had educated the privileged for generations before apparently falling on harder times. As I pulled up that Monday morning, something felt immediately wrong. The car park was nearly empty, just 3 other vehicles clustered near a side entrance. The main building's windows stared back at me like vacant eyes, many of them covered with what looked like black plastic sheeting from the inside. I checked the time, wondering if I'd somehow arrived ridiculously early or on the wrong day. But no, it was 8:15 a.m. on the date I'd been given. I remember sitting in my car for several minutes, the heater running against the January chill, debating whether to call the agency to double-check. Eventually, the thought of the promised payment compelled me to at least investigate. The reception area was unnervingly quiet. No staff bustling about, no children's voices echoing down corridors, none of the organized chaos that typically defines a school morning. The receptionist, a woman with a smile that never reached her eyes, seemed to be expecting me, taking my ID without really examining it, and handing me a staff badge and a printed schedule. When I asked about the apparent absence of students, she explained that most classes were on a week-long field trip, leaving only a small cohort of special focus students who needed additional attention. My schedule showed I'd be supervising these remaining students in various subjects throughout the week. I was directed to the staff room to prepare before my first class. The space felt wrong somehow, recently occupied but hastily emptied, personal touches removed, leaving behind a sterile functionality. 2 other teachers were there, both supply like me. They barely acknowledged my presence, hunched over their laptops with the hollow-eyed focus of people determined to avoid conversation. The strangest detail was a large digital clock on the wall, displaying what appeared to be a countdown rather than the time, 19:43:27, and steadily decreasing. When I asked about it, one of the other teachers muttered something about a special event week before returning to his screen. My first scheduled class was in room 213, but I could find no students waiting there. Just an empty classroom with desks arranged in a peculiar circular pattern, facing inward rather than toward the whiteboard. A high-end camera was mounted in the corner, its red recording light blinking steadily. I assumed it was for security or some modern teaching observation system. As I stood there confused, my school-issued phone pinged with a message directing me to report to the gymnasium instead. The labyrinthine corridors were eerily silent as I made my way through the building. Many doors were locked, some areas cordoned off with temporary barriers marked renovation in progress. The gymnasium had been transformed in a way that defied easy explanation. The traditional sports equipment had been replaced by what looked like an elaborate obstacle course. Balance beams, climbing walls, tunnels, and platforms arranged in a complex circuit. Above it all, more cameras were positioned at various angles, their red lights watching silently. In the center stood a group of about 15 people, who I initially assumed were older students, until I got closer and realized they ranged from what looked like university age to middle-aged adults. They wore identical grey tracksuits with numbers on the back. Their expressions carried a uniform vacancy that sent a chill through me, a mixture of resignation and fear that I couldn't reconcile with any normal educational scenario. A man in a crisp suit approached me, introducing himself as Mr. Walsh, the new headmaster. His handshake was too firm, his smile too practiced. He explained that I would be overseeing physical assessment exercises rather than traditional classes, as these special students were part of an experimental educational program for those who had struggled in conventional learning environments. Something about his explanation felt rehearsed, the educational jargon not quite masking whatever was actually happening. But I nodded along, telling myself this was just some progressive teaching method I hadn't encountered before. The substantial paycheck waiting at the end of the week helped silence the alarm bells ringing in my head. Mr. Walsh handed me a tablet, displaying what appeared to be a scoring system, with the participants' numbers listed alongside various metrics: time, points, penalties. He instructed me to record performances and input scores according to the criteria, emphasizing the importance of accuracy. Before leaving, he mentioned casually that the facility operated under strict confidentiality protocols due to the innovative nature of their methods. What followed was the first of what would become increasingly disturbing assessment sessions. The participants were instructed to complete the obstacle course while I timed them. Simple enough, except it quickly became apparent that there were consequences for poor performance. Those who took too long or failed certain obstacles were taken to a separate room by staff members who seemed more like security than educators. When these participants returned, they moved differently, more desperately, more fearfully. One woman's hands were shaking so badly she could barely climb the rope wall on her second attempt. A young man had a vacant expression that hadn't been there before, his movements mechanical, as if operating on instinct rather than conscious thought. I told myself they were just tired, or perhaps embarrassed by their performance. I ignored the strange marks on their wrists, the occasional flinch when certain staff members approached. I convinced myself this was some kind of intensive rehabilitation program for troubled adults, something well-intentioned despite its unusual methods. That evening, as I prepared to leave, I realized I'd left the scoring tablet in the staff room. When I returned to retrieve it, the room was occupied by Mr. Walsh and several others I hadn't seen before, gathered around a laptop. They didn't notice me in the doorway as I overheard fragments of their conversation, mentions of increasing viewership, higher stakes for tomorrow's challenges, and bidding wars for the elimination round. One phrase in particular froze me in place. The dark web audience is getting bored with standard obstacles. They want to see real consequences. I backed away quietly, heart pounding. In my car, I sat trembling, trying to make sense of what I'd overheard. Was this some kind of illegal streaming operation? Were these participants actually prisoners or captives? The implications were too horrific to fully process. I should have driven straight to the police. I should have reported what I'd seen and heard immediately. Instead, I did the unforgivable. I went home, told myself I would think more clearly after a night's sleep, that perhaps I had misunderstood or exaggerated the situation in my mind. The next morning, against all better judgment, I returned. I told myself I needed evidence before making accusations, that walking away might abandon those people to whatever was happening at Greenwood. In reality, I was driven by a terrible curiosity and the shameful knowledge that I needed that week's pay more than I wanted to admit. The second day brought new assessments that were increasingly difficult and bizarre. Participants were now competing directly against each other in pairs, with the losers facing unspecified demerits. The exercises seemed designed to create maximum stress and visible suffering. Holding painful positions for extended periods, completing memory tasks while being subjected to disorienting noise, running until collapse. I noticed more details that couldn't be explained away. The way certain staff members adjusted camera angles to capture participants' faces during moments of greatest distress. The elaborate scoring system that seemed to award points for visible emotional breakdown as much as physical performance. The way information was being entered into a separate system labeled Viewer Engagement Metrics. During lunch break, I managed to access an unlocked computer in one of the classrooms. The browser history had been cleared, but a bookmark caught my attention. An unmarked folder that opened to reveal a Tor browser shortcut. I clicked it, finding myself on a site called Academy Games that required login credentials I didn't have. But the landing page was enough to confirm my worst fears. It showed silhouettes of people in postures of distress, alongside betting odds and viewing packages available in cryptocurrency. As I stared at the screen, trying to process the horror of what I was seeing, a reflection in the monitor showed someone entering the room behind me. I quickly closed the browser, pretending to organize papers, my heart thundering in my chest. It was one of the other supply teachers, looking as hollow-eyed as before. He gave me a long, evaluating look before leaving without a word. That afternoon, the assessments took a darker turn. What had been merely grueling now became actively dangerous. An obstacle course over concrete floors with no safety mats. A memory challenge where incorrect answers resulted in what appeared to be electric shocks. A balance exercise on narrow beams suspended at uncomfortable heights. I watched participants stumble, fall, and cry out in pain, all while the cameras recorded every moment of suffering. Each time, I dutifully recorded scores on the tablet, hating myself with every input, telling myself I was gathering evidence while becoming increasingly complicit. The digital countdown in the staff room now read 9:17:42. Whatever event they were building toward was approaching, and the exercises were escalating in intensity as it drew nearer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my flat, drafting and deleting emails to the police, unable to find words that wouldn't implicate me in whatever was happening. I searched online for information about Greenwood Academy, finding only a bare-bones website that had clearly been created recently, with stock photos of smiling students who I suspected had never set foot in the actual building. On the third day, I arrived early, determined to find more concrete evidence. The car park had more vehicles than before, including several expensive models I hadn't seen previously. Inside, there was a palpable energy in the air. Staff moved with greater purpose, checking equipment, adjusting cameras. I overheard Mr. Walsh instructing someone to prepare the elimination arena for the following day. The casual way he discussed it, like he was talking about setting up for a school play, rather than something that carried ominous implications of life and death, chilled me to my core. That day's assessments were individual challenges focused on psychological breaking points rather than physical abilities. Participants were isolated in separate rooms, subjected to tasks designed to induce maximum stress, solving impossible puzzles with countdown timers, enduring sensory overload, standing perfectly still for hours under bright lights. Through the observation windows, I watched their gradual deterioration, the slumped shoulders, the vacant stares, the occasional complete breakdown. All of it captured by multiple camera angles, all of it scored and transmitted to whatever audience was paying to watch this systematic destruction of human dignity. I couldn't take it anymore. During lunch, I feigned illness and asked to leave early. Mr. Walsh seemed suspicious, but allowed it, reminding me of my confidentiality obligations, with a smile that communicated a clear threat. As I walked to my car, I noticed new security personnel stationed around the perimeter of the building. One followed me to my car, watching as I drove away. I spent that evening gathering what evidence I could, notes I'd taken, photos I'd managed to discreetly capture on my phone, screenshots of the staff schedule showing names and times. It wasn't much, but it was something to take to the authorities. I drafted an email to a journalist whose contact information I'd found online, attaching everything I had. I was about to send it when my doorbell rang, unusual for 11 p.m. on a weeknight. Through the peephole, I saw Mr. Walsh and two men I recognized as security from Greenwood. My blood went cold. I backed away from the door, grabbing my phone to call the police. But before I could dial, a notification appeared, a text message from an unknown number containing my home address, followed by a second message with a live image of my front door, taken from a perspective that meant someone else was watching me right now. I fled through the back door, taking only my phone and wallet, scaling the garden fence into the alley behind my block of flats. I spent that night in a budget hotel paid for in cash, paralyzed with indecision and fear. In the morning, after hours of internal debate, I made my decision. I would return to Greenwood one last time, use my access to gather irrefutable evidence, and then go directly to the police. I couldn't live with myself if I simply ran away, leaving those people to whatever elimination event was approaching. When I arrived for the fourth day, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The countdown now read 01:23:45. Additional technical equipment had been brought in. More sophisticated cameras, lighting rigs, what looked like medical monitoring devices. The participants were nowhere to be seen during the morning, presumably being prepared for whatever was coming. Mr. Walsh greeted me with surprising warmth, making no mention of his visit to my home the previous night. He informed me that my role would be changing. I would be assisting with the final assessment preparations rather than scoring individual challenges. He handed me a different tablet, this one showing a tournament-style bracket with the participants' numbers paired against each other. The gymnasium had been transformed again, now resembling an arena with a central platform surrounded by cameras and lights. The obstacle equipment had been replaced by various stations containing what appeared to be weapons, though surely they couldn't be real. Could they? My question was answered that afternoon when the participants were brought in. Their grey tracksuits had been replaced with different coloured outfits corresponding to their positions on the tournament bracket. Their expressions ranged from blank dissociation to raw terror. Several had visible injuries from previous days' assessments. Mr. Walsh addressed them, his words inaudible to me from my position, but their reactions told me enough. Slumped shoulders, shaking heads, one woman collapsing to her knees before being roughly helped up by security personnel. I was stationed at a control panel that operated various elements of the arena: lights, sounds, moving platforms. Another staff member explained that tomorrow's final assessment would pit participants against each other in direct competition, with real consequences for failure. The clinical way this was described made it clear that these consequences extended far beyond losing a game. As this was explained to me, I noticed new faces arriving, well-dressed people being escorted to an observation area overlooking the gymnasium. They carried themselves with the entitled air of those accustomed to purchasing whatever they desired, however illegal or immoral. They were being given tablets similar to mine, but with additional options I couldn't see from my position. I realized with growing horror that these were not just online viewers, but VIP audience members who had paid to watch in person, perhaps even to influence the games directly through their devices. That evening, as staff prepared to lock down the facility for the night, I managed to access an unlocked administrative office. Inside, I found what I'd been looking for: hard evidence of the operation. A laptop left open showed a streaming interface for the Academy Games, complete with viewer counts in the thousands, cryptocurrency payment processors, and chat logs filled with disturbing requests from users with anonymized handles. Most chillingly, I found a document listing the participants, their real names, backgrounds, and how they had been acquired. Some had been lured with promises of clearing debts or legal troubles. Others simply abducted from situations where they wouldn't be missed. Each had a market value and audience rating assigned to them like commodities. I used my phone to photograph everything I could, downloaded files to a USB drive I found in the desk, and was preparing to leave when I heard voices approaching. I hid beneath the desk, scarcely breathing, as two people entered. I recognized Mr. Walsh's voice instantly. The other belonged to one of the VIP visitors. Their conversation confirmed my worst fears. Tomorrow's final assessment was a fight to the death, disguised as an elaborate tournament, but designed to end in necessary eliminations for the entertainment of paying viewers on the dark web. The highest bidders would control aspects of the competition, from weapon selection to environmental hazards. The survivor would be recycled into future games. They discussed the operation's broader scope, how Greenwood was just one of several such facilities, each disguised as a legitimate institution, each broadcasting human suffering to an audience willing to pay premium prices for increasingly extreme content. The casual way they discussed profit margins and inventory management made me physically ill. After they left, I remained frozen in place, the full horror of my situation sinking in. I wasn't just witnessing a criminal enterprise. I had been unwittingly recruited into one. My name was on their staff records, my fingerprints on their equipment, my face on their security cameras. If I went to the police, how could I prove I wasn't a willing participant? But I couldn't walk away. Not now, not knowing what would happen when that countdown reached 0. I made my decision. Using the admin computer, I sent everything I'd gathered to every news outlet and police department I could find, scheduling the emails to send automatically the following morning. Then I erased all evidence of what I'd done and prepared to leave. As I crept through the darkened corridors toward a fire exit I'd identified earlier, I heard sounds coming from behind a door marked Participant Preparation. Inside, I found the contestants confined in what had once been changing rooms, now converted to cells. Some slept fitfully on narrow cots. Others sat staring vacantly at walls. A few wept quietly. One woman noticed me, the same one who had collapsed earlier. Her eyes focused on my staff badge, then my face, registering that I was different from the other staff. She mouthed something I couldn't understand, her expression pleading. I made a split-second decision that would change everything. I used my staff access card to unlock the security door, gesturing urgently for them to follow me. Some responded immediately. Others seemed too broken to comprehend what was happening. I couldn't force them. I could only offer the chance. 7 participants followed me through the dark corridors, moving as silently as possible toward the fire exit. We were nearly there when alarms suddenly blared throughout the building. Someone had noticed. Either the empty cells or my access card being used where it shouldn't be. What followed was chaos. Security personnel flooded the corridors. Some participants panicked and ran in different directions. Others froze in terror. I lost track of who went where in the confusion of flashing lights and blaring alarms. I found myself running alongside just 2 others, the woman who had first noticed me, and a younger man who moved with surprising determination despite his obvious exhaustion. We burst through the fire exit into the cold night air, the alarm shrieking behind us as we sprinted across the grounds toward the perimeter fence. Shouts and flashlight beams cut through the darkness behind us. The woman stumbled and fell. I helped her up, but security was closing in. The young man reached the fence first, finding a section where it had been improperly repaired, perhaps from a previous escape attempt. He pulled back the chain link, creating a gap just large enough to squeeze through. The woman went first. As the young man followed, I made the decision that haunts me still. I pushed him through and told them to run, then turned back toward our pursuers. Someone needed to delay security, to give the others a chance. It would be me. What happened next exists in my memory as fragmented images and sensations. The impact as security personnel tackled me to the ground, the cold metal of handcuffs around my wrists. Being dragged back into the building, Mr. Walsh's face contorted with rage as he questioned me about the others. I remember being taken to a room I hadn't seen before, small, windowless, containing only a chair bolted to the floor and a camera mounted in the corner. Its red light blinked steadily as Mr. Walsh explained my new role at Greenwood. No longer staff, now special participant in tomorrow's event. I spent that night handcuffed to a pipe in what had once been a storage cupboard, listening to the preparations continuing around me, the countdown ticking closer to 0. I thought about the 2 who had escaped, wondering if they had truly gotten away, or if they had been recaptured in the woods surrounding the property. I wondered if my scheduled emails would send, if anyone would investigate, if anyone would believe what was happening. Morning came. I was dressed in a yellow tracksuit, my assigned tournament color, and taken to the arena where the other participants waited. Some looked at me with recognition, others with the empty gaze of those who had already surrendered to their fate. I searched for the 5 who had attempted escape with us, but hadn't made it through the fence. They were nowhere to be seen. The VIP viewers watched from their observation area, sipping champagne, as Mr. Walsh explained the rules of the final assessment. His eyes lingered on me as he detailed the consequences of non-participation. The countdown on the wall reached 0, replaced by a new timer. 3 hours to determine who would survive. What happened in that arena over those 3 hours is something I cannot fully describe. Not because I don't remember, but because putting it into words feels like reliving it. The weapons were real enough to cause pain, but designed to create prolonged suffering, rather than quick endings. The environment shifted according to viewer preferences. Lights blinding, then plunging us into darkness. Floors becoming electrified. Obstacles appearing and disappearing. Participants turned on each other, some fighting desperately, others simply trying to hide. I focused solely on survival, on finding a way out, watching the patterns of the security personnel, looking for weaknesses in their operation. The opportunity came during a power fluctuation, perhaps caused by the massive energy demands of the broadcast equipment, perhaps a deliberate part of the spectacle. Emergency lights activated, security doors reset to their default state, and in the momentary confusion, I slipped away from the arena into a service corridor I'd identified earlier. From there, I navigated through the building's underbelly, maintenance tunnels, boiler rooms, areas that existed beneath the performance spaces where the cameras couldn't see. I found my way to a loading dock where supplies were delivered, waiting until a delivery van arrived with what appeared to be additional technical equipment. When the driver left his vehicle unattended for a moment, I did the only thing I could. I climbed into the back among the shipping crates and hid beneath a tarp, hardly daring to breathe as the doors were closed and the van eventually drove away. I escaped. Others didn't. My scheduled email sent, but the response was not what I had hoped. By the time authorities investigated, Greenwood had been emptied, equipment dismantled, evidence removed, staff and participants vanished. The building stood vacant, just another failed private school with financial problems, according to the property records hastily created to establish a paper trail. The few news outlets that followed up found nothing conclusive, just an empty building and local officials with no recollection of any unusual activity. My evidence was dismissed as elaborate fiction, my account deemed the product of stress or mental illness. The dark website disappeared, presumably relocated to another academy somewhere else. I live differently now. New name, new city, constant movement. I avoid cameras, use cash only, stay offline as much as possible. I know they're looking for me, not just for escape, but for exposing their operation. However briefly, I represent a loose end in a business that cannot afford any. Sometimes I search for any trace of the 2 who escaped with me, hoping they truly got away, that they found some way to reclaim their lives. More often, I find myself looking at strangers on the street, wondering if they've watched content like what was produced at Greenwood, if they've ever paid to see suffering, if they understand that behind their screens are real people being destroyed for entertainment. The gamification of human suffering didn't start or end with Greenwood. It continues in hidden places, behind legitimate facades, funded by those willing to pay to watch the worst of humanity. And somewhere, on the dark web, countdowns are ticking towards zero, participants are being prepared, and viewers are placing bids on who will survive the next round. I know because sometimes, in moments of weakness and self-destruction, I search for traces of these broadcasts, not to watch, but to gather evidence, to find another facility, to somehow make someone believe what I experienced. In those digital shadows, I occasionally glimpse familiar formats, scoring systems, tournament brackets that echo what I saw at Greenwood. The games continue, and every time I see a school closed for renovation, every time I hear about people gone missing who fit a certain profile, I wonder if another countdown has begun. I can't get the sound out of my head, the soft tap of an auction paddle against a palm. It's been 2 years, but I still wake up at 1 in the morning, drenched in sweat. You know how some memories just stick with you, no matter how hard you try to forget. The good ones fade away over time, but the horrific ones, those stay crystal clear. Every detail, every smell, every feeling of absolute terror. For me, it's the soft tap of an auction paddle that still jolts me from sleep. The sound of wealth deciding who lives and who suffers. I was working as a freelance photographer for a lifestyle magazine in London, specializing in those behind-the-scenes pieces about trendy bars and restaurants, the kind that make readers feel like insiders to some exclusive world. My editor had sent me to document the Wreathed Heart, this newly renovated Victorian pub in Whitechapel that had become inexplicably popular among finance types and tech entrepreneurs, seemingly overnight. It was late October, that liminal time when London transitions from merely damp to bone-chillingly cold. I remember the peculiar fog that had settled over the East End that evening, how it seemed to swallow the street lights into hazy coronas. The pub itself was unassuming from the outside, just another historic building with glossy black paint and gold lettering, indistinguishable from 100 others scattered across the city. Inside was different, not what you'd expect from a traditional British pub. No dark wood or worn leather, but minimalist furnishings in blacks and whites, with these disconcerting anatomical drawings of human hearts framed on the walls. Not the cartoon Valentine hearts, but detailed medical illustrations, some showing dissections or peculiar conditions. I remember thinking it was an odd aesthetic choice for a place serving food and drinks. The manager who'd arranged the shoot was a woman named Eleanor, mid-30s, expensively dressed in that deliberately understated way that actually costs more than flashy clothes. She had this practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes, like someone who'd learned human expressions from a manual. After showing me around the main bar area, she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was a private members' space in the back I should photograph later when it was empty. I spent the first hour capturing the usual shots, bartenders crafting elaborate cocktails, the architectural details, patrons enjoying their overpriced drinks, standard stuff. Around 10, the place began filling with people who looked like they'd just stepped out of boardrooms. Men in bespoke suits, women with that particular kind of polished appearance that speaks of serious money. They carried themselves with the entitled air of people accustomed to doors opening at their approach. What struck me was how they barely ordered drinks. They'd approach the bar, exchange a few words with the bartender, then be directed toward a dark hallway at the back of the pub. None of them returned to the main area. I thought perhaps there was a separate exit, or maybe some exclusive area where they could drink away from the regular clientele. Around midnight, Eleanor returned, seeming slightly tense as she informed me the private area was now available for photography. She led me down that same hallway the wealthy patrons had disappeared into, past the toilets and what looked like storage rooms, to an unmarked black door with a small digital keypad beside it. She entered a code, and I distinctly remember the sound. Not the electronic beep you'd expect, but a soft, mechanical click, like something much older than the sleek technology suggested. Beyond the door was a short corridor ending in another door, this one attended by a man who looked more like military personnel than a bouncer. Close-cropped hair, perfect posture, alert eyes that assessed me with unsettling thoroughness. Eleanor exchanged a few words with him, and he stepped aside, opening the second door. The space beyond was dramatically different from the minimalist modern pub we'd left behind. It was like stepping into a Victorian gentleman's club. Wood-panelled walls, leather armchairs, the air heavy with expensive cigars and whiskey. But something felt off about it, something I couldn't immediately identify. Perhaps it was how the atmospheric lighting seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate, or how the room was arranged in a semicircle facing a raised platform area at the front, currently empty but spotlit like a stage. Eleanor instructed me to photograph the empty room quickly, explaining that it was a private auction space for rare collectibles and investments, only accessible to their top-tier members. She emphasized that I should focus on the architectural details and ambience, not any identifying features of the space that might appear in a magazine. I nodded, already framing shots in my mind, thinking this would make for an intriguing centerpiece to my article, the secret room that few knew existed. As I was setting up my tripod, Eleanor was called away by one of the staff. She excused herself, saying she'd return shortly, leaving me alone in that strangely oppressive room. I took the opportunity to explore more freely, noting details that seemed at odds with the rare collectibles explanation. A medical-grade refrigeration unit humming quietly in one corner. Several screens mounted on the walls but currently powered down. Small cameras positioned discreetly throughout the space. On the podium at the front sat an open laptop, its screen showing what appeared to be a spreadsheet with columns for numbers, dates, and what looked like cryptocurrency wallet addresses. Beside it was a stack of black leather-bound portfolios, each with a different Roman numeral embossed in gold. Curiosity got the better of me. I glanced toward the door, confirming I was still alone, then carefully opened the top portfolio marked I. Inside were photographs and specifications, but not of art or antiques. The images showed people, men and women of various ages and ethnicities, each photographed in the same clinical style against a white background. Beside each image was detailed information: height, weight, age, blood type, medical history, psychological profile, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be an estimated resilience rating on a scale of 1 to 10. My mind refused to process what I was seeing at first, creating more palatable explanations. Perhaps this was for some exclusive medical treatment program, or an elaborate reality show, or high-end surrogacy services. But the final page of the portfolio shattered any comforting illusions. It contained detailed pricing structures for what it explicitly called direct control sessions of varying durations, with higher rates for terminal experiences. I felt physically ill as understanding crashed over me. This wasn't an auction for objects but for people, for the right to torture and possibly kill them while watching in real time. The refrigeration unit suddenly made horrific sense. It wasn't for wine, but for preserving evidence or trophies. The screens would be for remote bidders or for displaying the sessions themselves. I must have made some sound, some small gasp of horror, because the door behind me opened. I snapped a hasty photo of the portfolio's contents with my phone before closing it and pretending to adjust my camera settings. Eleanor returned with two men I hadn't seen before, both in dark suits, both moving with the deliberate precision of predators. She asked if I'd finished, her tone perfectly pleasant, but her eyes scanning the room, noting the portfolio that wasn't quite in the same position I'd found it. I forced a smile, saying I needed just a few more shots. My hands were trembling as I pretended to photograph a particularly ornate section of wall paneling. I could feel their eyes on my back, assessing, calculating. Eleanor mentioned casually that their event would begin soon, so I'd need to wrap up. She asked if I'd seen anything interesting while she was gone, her voice still conversational, but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of threat. I lied, saying I'd been focused on capturing the unique lighting of the space. She smiled that same empty smile and said something about how people often found themselves fascinated by things they didn't understand in this room. As I packed up my equipment, moving with deliberate slowness to appear calm while my mind raced through escape scenarios, the door opened again. A stream of people began entering. The same wealthy individuals I'd seen earlier, now carrying small electronic tablets and what looked like auction paddles made of some dark material. Eleanor guided me toward the exit, her hand on my elbow in what might have appeared to be a polite gesture, but felt more like a restraint. As we approached the door, it opened to admit one last patron, a man I recognized with a sickening jolt. He was a tech CEO who'd been featured in the same magazine I was shooting for, known for his philanthropy and ethical business practices. Our eyes met briefly. Something in my expression must have betrayed my knowledge or horror, because his pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. He leaned toward Eleanor, whispering something that made her grip on my arm tighten painfully. We continued to the corridor, where the security man waited. Eleanor instructed him to escort me out through the service entrance since the event was beginning. Something in her tone had changed, a hardness that hadn't been there before. She reminded me that all the photos needed to be approved before publication, and that I'd signed an extensive NDA that covered not just images but any observations made on the premises. The security man led me down a different corridor, one that seemed to take us deeper into the building rather than toward an exit. My heart was hammering so loudly I was certain he could hear it. We passed doors marked with symbols rather than numbers, a circle, a square, a triangle, from behind which I could hear sounds that will haunt me forever. Not screams, which would have been horrific enough, but the muffled, desperate sounds of people trying not to scream. I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't be leaving through any service entrance, that I'd seen and understood too much, that I was being led to one of those rooms with symbols instead of numbers to become part of the night's inventory. Desperation makes you capable of things you never imagined. As we passed a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, I stumbled deliberately, apologizing for my clumsiness. When the security man turned slightly to help me up, I grabbed the extinguisher and swung it with all my strength at his head. There was a sickening crack, and he crumpled to the floor. I ran, no longer caring about stealth, simply needing to find a way out of this nightmare. I tried doors as I passed them, most locked, one opening to reveal a small room with medical equipment and restraints that made me slam it shut immediately. Finally, I found a door marked with the universal fire exit symbol. pushed through it, and found myself in an alley behind the building. I didn't stop running until I was back on a main road, surrounded by late-night revelers who had no idea of the horrors occurring just streets away. I hailed a taxi, giving an address nowhere near my actual home, constantly checking to see if I was being followed. That night, I copied the photo I'd taken of the portfolio to multiple secure locations, then erased all evidence of my assignment from my phone. I scrubbed my social media, packed essential belongings, and by morning was on a train to Edinburgh, where an old university friend had agreed to let me stay without asking questions. I spent weeks debating what to do with what I'd discovered. Going to the police seemed logical, but the man I'd recognized was connected to the highest levels of society and government. The NDA I'd signed contained language I now recognized as thinly veiled threats, and I had only a single photo as evidence, easily dismissed as a forgery or misunderstanding. Eventually, I created an anonymous account and shared what I discovered on forums dedicated to investigating human trafficking and dark web crimes. I included the photo, names I remembered, descriptions of the location and security measures. Some believed me. Others dismissed my story as paranoia or creative fiction. 3 weeks later, the wreathed heart was destroyed in what was reported as a gas explosion. No casualties, since it happened during closed hours. The news mentioned its popularity among London's elite and its unique Victorian interior that had been largely preserved during renovation. I knew it wasn't an accident. It was evidence being erased. Or was it because of my posts, or simply a planned relocation of their operation? I'll never know. Since then, I've been moving constantly, never staying in one place long enough to establish connections. I've changed careers, appearance, habits. I use only cash, avoid cameras, stay away from social media. But sometimes, in the faces of the wealthy and powerful on news broadcasts, I catch glimpses of expressions I recognize from that night. That same cold calculation beneath a veneer of respectability. I know now that there are spaces hidden within ordinary places where the elite trade in the ultimate luxury, complete power over human life, where suffering is commodified and sold to the highest bidder, where people like me, who stumble upon their existence, become potential inventory. Sometimes I dream of that auction room. In my dreams, I'm never the photographer, but the subject being displayed on that platform, facing a sea of expressionless faces holding black paddles. And in the front row always sits that tech CEO, smiling as he delicately taps his paddle against his palm, signaling his bid for the right to break me completely. I don't know if they're still looking for me. I don't know if my name is in one of those portfolios now, with my own resilience rating and price point. But I know that somewhere, perhaps behind another unmarked door in another ordinary establishment, paddles are being raised and lives are being sold, and no one who matters is doing anything to stop it. You know that scraping sound? Metal against metal. It gets me every time. Doesn't matter if it's just someone dragging a bin across the pavement or a car door shutting too hard. My body reacts before my brain can catch up. Heart racing, sweating instantly, muscles tensing up like I'm about to fight or run. It's been 16 months since I got out of that shipping container, but honestly, I don't think I'll ever really get out. Not completely. Part of me is still in there watching that screen, waiting for the next sick instruction to appear. I've tried therapy, meditation, even moved to a completely different city, but some things just stick with you, you know. I was working as a delivery driver back then, mostly doing long-haul routes across the Midlands. Not the most exciting job, but it paid decent money and kept me moving, which I've always preferred to being stuck in one place. The company I worked for wasn't exactly top tier, the kind that would take on jobs other companies rejected due to tight deadlines or unusual delivery locations. I didn't ask questions, just drove where the dispatcher told me and collected my pay at the end of the week. That particular day started normally enough. I'd been assigned a pickup at this industrial estate outside Birmingham, one of those sprawling concrete landscapes filled with identical warehouses and not enough signs. The GPS coordinates I'd been given led me to a section that seemed less maintained than the rest, with fewer operational businesses and more abandoned units boarded up with metal sheets. I remember thinking it was odd, but figured it was probably just some startup using cheap space or a business in the process of relocating. When I arrived at the exact location, there was nothing but a solitary shipping container sitting in what had once been a loading bay for a warehouse. No office, no staff, not even proper lighting. Just this standard metal container, painted that typical rust-resistant blue you see everywhere. I double-checked the address, called dispatch to confirm, and was told to proceed with the pickup as planned. The manifest listed the contents as electronic testing equipment, bound for a research facility up north. Weight was given as approximately 200 kilos, nothing unusual for the type of deliveries I typically handled. I backed my truck up to the container as best I could in the awkward space. No one appeared to help with loading, which wasn't entirely unusual for these outlying pickups. Sometimes clients would leave items ready to go with paperwork attached, especially for after-hours collections. What was strange was the lack of any paperwork on or near the container. No shipping labels, no manifest, not even a padlock securing it, just a simple latch that anyone could open. As I approached to check if there might be documents inside, I noticed a small digital keypad mounted next to the container doors that I hadn't spotted from the truck. It looked newer than the container itself, with a glowing blue display asking for a 6-digit code. I hadn't been given any code by dispatch, so I called in again. The dispatcher seemed confused, put me on hold for several minutes, then returned to tell me the client had just sent over the access code 789021 and apologized for the oversight. I punched in the numbers and the keypad emitted a soft beep before the display changed to access granted. There was a mechanical click and the container door released slightly, swinging open just enough for me to see it was dark inside. I used my phone torch to peer in, expecting to find crates of equipment that I'd need to load onto my truck. Instead, my light revealed a space that had been converted into something else entirely. Not a storage unit, but what looked like a makeshift room. The interior walls had been covered with some sort of sound-dampening material, dark and textured. A simple cot was bolted to one wall. A small chemical toilet sat in one corner. Most bizarrely, mounted on the far wall was a large flat-screen monitor, currently dark but clearly operational based on the small power light glowing at its base. I hesitated at the threshold, that first real twinge of unease creeping up my spine. This clearly wasn't any electronic equipment for delivery. Part of me knew I should close the door, call dispatch again, or even the police, and leave immediately. But curiosity pushed me forward, that fatal human flaw that leads us into situations we should avoid. I wanted to understand what I was looking at, to make sense of the discrepancy between what I'd been told and what I was seeing. I stepped fully inside, sweeping my torch around to better examine the strange setup. That's when I heard the door behind me swing shut with a metallic groan, followed by the definitive click of a lock engaging. I spun around, dropping my phone in my panic, plunging the space into near total darkness, save for the dim light coming from my phone on the floor. I lunged for the door, pulling at the handle that no longer yielded to pressure. I pounded on the metal, shouting for help, though I knew the industrial estate was largely deserted, especially at that hour. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small camera mounted in the upper corner of the container, its red recording light now active and tracking my movements. Almost simultaneously, the monitor on the wall flickered to life, illuminating the container with a harsh blue glow. The screen displayed what appeared to be a loading symbol, rotating slowly against a black background. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, text appeared on the screen. "Welcome, participant number 24. Please remain calm. Your cooperation ensures your survival." My first thought was that this had to be some elaborate prank. Maybe one of those extreme reality shows where they put people in stressful situations for entertainment. I even said as much aloud, telling whoever was watching that I wasn't interested in participating and wanted to be released immediately. The screen remained unchanged, the message glowing mockingly in the darkness. Then I heard another sound that sent ice through my veins, movement outside the container. Someone else was there. Before I could process what this might mean, a different mechanical sound came from the opposite end of the container. Not the doors I'd entered through, but what I'd assumed was just the solid back wall. A section of it was sliding open, revealing another compartment of the container that had been hidden from view. In the dim blue light from the screen, I could make out a figure huddled in that newly revealed space. A man, maybe mid-30s, looking as terrified and confused as I felt. He was trembling visibly, his clothes dirty and torn, with what appeared to be dried blood on his sleeve. Most disturbingly, his wrist bore raw marks suggesting he'd been restrained recently. The screen changed again, now displaying two columns with our apparent designations: participant number 24 and participant number 23. Below this appeared new text. "The game is simple. One must harm the other according to viewer instructions. Refusal results in punishment for both. Completion results in freedom for one." As if to emphasize the seriousness of these instructions, small panels in the ceiling slid open, and what looked like gas nozzles descended slightly. The message was clear: cooperate or suffer consequences. I tried to communicate with the other man, to suggest we find a way out together, but he seemed beyond rational thought, curled into himself and rocking slightly. I couldn't blame him. Based on his appearance, he'd been in this nightmare longer than I had. The screen updated again, now showing a split view. One side displayed the interior of our container from the camera's perspective, while the other showed what appeared to be a chat window filling with messages. With dawning horror, I realized we were being broadcast somewhere online, likely the dark web, based on the anonymous usernames and the disturbing nature of the comments scrolling past. These weren't just viewers, but paying customers placing requests for what they wanted to see happen between us. A timer appeared in the corner of the screen, 10 minutes, counting down. Below it, highlighted in red: first challenge, participant number 24 must draw blood from participant number 23. Viewers choose method. The wall beside the monitor slid open to reveal a recessed panel containing various implements: a hammer, pliers, a box cutter, scissors. Tools that in any other context would be mundane, but in this setting became instruments of torture. I refused, of course, stood my ground, and shouted at the camera, that I wouldn't participate in this sick game. The other man watched me with a mixture of hope and resignation that suggested he'd seen this scenario play out before. When the timer reached 8 a.m., a warning appeared. Compliance expected. Final warning. I maintained my refusal, believing, perhaps naively, that whoever was behind this would eventually realize I couldn't be coerced. At 7:30, a fine mist began spraying from the ceiling nozzle. The effect was almost instantaneous. A burning sensation on exposed skin, quickly intensifying to something beyond pain, beyond description. It felt like being flayed alive, nerve endings simultaneously on fire and exposed to ice. Both of us were screaming, clawing at our skin for relief that wouldn't come. After 15 seconds that felt like years, the spray stopped. The timer had paused at 7:15. New text appeared. Demonstration complete. Proceed with challenge or full deployment will follow. In that moment, something fundamental broke inside me. The absolute isolation of our situation became crystal clear. We were truly alone, at the mercy of unseen viewers who were deriving entertainment from our suffering. No help was coming, no rescue. Just the cold calculation of whether compliance would cause less suffering than resistance. I wish I could tell you I maintained my moral stance, that I continued to refuse despite the consequences. That would make for a more heroic story. But pain has a way of rewiring your principles, of reducing complex ethical frameworks to the simple binary of relief versus suffering. I moved toward the panel of tools, my movements mechanical and disconnected from my consciousness, as if watching someone else control my body. I selected the scissors, somehow seeming the least brutal option among monstrous choices. The other man didn't resist or try to fight me. He simply extended his arm, his eyes vacant, already knowing the routine of this horrific theater. I made the smallest cut I could on his forearm, just enough to draw the blood required by the challenge. A chime sounded from the screen, the timer stopped, and new text appeared. Challenge completed. Viewer satisfaction, 37%. Higher satisfaction increases freedom probability. That was just the beginning. What followed was a descent into nightmare that lasted for what I later learned was 3 days, but felt like weeks. The challenges escalated in their cruelty and specificity, each one presented with the same clinical detachment. Each refusal met with that unbearable chemical spray or other punishments. Extreme temperatures, deafening noise, electric shocks delivered through the metal floor. The viewers grew more numerous as our show apparently gained popularity in whatever dark corner of the internet it was being broadcast. Their requests became more specific, more depraved. And with each challenge, the viewer satisfaction rating became the metric by which our value was measured. The most horrific aspect wasn't the physical pain, though that was substantial. It was the way the system gradually turned us against each other, transforming us from potential allies into instruments of each other's suffering. With each hour, I could feel my humanity being systematically stripped away, replaced by a desperate animal focused only on avoiding the next punishment, on ensuring that if someone had to suffer more, it would be him instead of me. On what I believe was the third day, something changed. The challenges had been escalating toward what was clearly intended to be a fatal conclusion, the ultimate entertainment for the viewers. The screen displayed our final challenge with brutal simplicity. Conclusion. Phase. Only one participant exits. Viewers will determine method. As the voting commenced, visible on the screen as percentages next to various lethal options, I noticed something unprecedented. a fluctuation in the power. The lights on the camera briefly dimmed, and the screen flickered. Something was happening outside our controlled environment. Moments later, there was a commotion outside the container, muffled shouting, the sound of multiple vehicles arriving. The screen went black, plunging us into darkness. Then came the sound of metal tools against the container doors, the screech of the locking mechanism being forced open from the outside. I later learned that our location had been traced through a combination of police work and grey hat hackers who had infiltrated the streaming platform. An international task force had been tracking this operation for months. A sophisticated network that abducted people from various locations, placing them in identical shipping containers around the country for these brutal broadcasts. The aftermath has been its own kind of nightmare. Physical recovery, psychological evaluations, police interviews, where I had to recount every degrading detail, every moment when I chose my survival over someone else's suffering. The other man, I learned his name was Adrian, that he had been a warehouse worker who disappeared 3 weeks before I was taken. Didn't survive the medical evacuation. His body had simply endured too much trauma over his longer captivity. The police identified 13 other containers across the UK, each set up identically, each containing similar scenarios in various stages. Most of the victims were already dead. Those who survived bear the same hollow look I now see in my own reflection. People who have glimpsed humanity's darkest potential and can never unsee it. The operators of the site were never fully identified. The broadcasting equipment was sophisticated, but designed to leave minimal digital footprints. The money trail led through so many cryptocurrencies and shell accounts that it eventually went cold. The most the authorities could tell me was that the viewership had been global and substantial, with thousands paying premium rates to watch and influence our torment. I now live in a different city, under a different name. I work from home, avoiding public transportation and open spaces. I've sealed every vent in my flat, installed multiple locks on all doors and windows. I sleep with the lights on when I sleep at all. Because the most terrifying aspect of what happened isn't the physical pain I endured or the nightmares that continue to plague me. It's the knowledge that there are people, ordinary people with jobs and families and seemingly normal lives, who would pay to watch strangers torture each other. People who would take pleasure in voting for which fingers should be broken first or how deep a cut should be. People who walk among us every day, carrying this capacity for calculated cruelty behind unremarkable faces. Sometimes I find myself studying strangers on the rare occasions I venture outside, wondering if they were among the viewers, if they voted on methods to hurt me, if they were disappointed when the broadcast was interrupted before its intended conclusion. And in my darkest moments, I wonder about the viewing statistics that were displayed on that screen, how the satisfaction rating increased when I became more brutal, more creative in following their instructions. I wonder about the moment when I stopped hesitating before causing pain, when part of me began anticipating the next challenge with something other than dread. Because the true horror of that shipping container wasn't just being locked inside with someone tasked to mutilate me. It was discovering how quickly I became that someone for him in return, and how much of that person still lives inside me, waiting for the next instruction to appear on the screen. I haven't been able to look at medical scrub since it happened. That specific shade of blue-green sends me into a cold sweat every time I spot it in a hospital corridor or even on a TV show. The sound of rubber gloves snapping against wrists makes me physically ill. 3 years later, and my body still remembers everything my mind desperately tries to forget about wellness solutions. I was in my final year of nursing school when money got tight, like eating nothing but ramen for weeks tight. My student loans barely covered tuition, and London rent was bleeding me dry. I'd been picking up odd healthcare jobs through this app that connected medical students with private clinics needing temporary staff. Most gigs were straightforward, covering for staff on holiday, helping with administrative backlogs, that sort of thing. The pay was decent, the hours flexible around my classes. That's how I found the listing for wellness solutions. They needed someone for weekend overnight shifts, primarily monitoring post-operative patients and maintaining basic records. The pay was nearly triple what other clinics offered, a detail that should have raised red flags immediately. But when you're staring at an eviction notice and surviving on tea and toast, rational thinking takes a backseat to desperation. The clinic was located in one of those converted industrial buildings in East London, the kind that developers renovate into luxury spaces while keeping exposed brick and ductwork to seem trendy. From the outside, it looked professional enough. Clean signage, security cameras, proper access control. The reception area was minimalist but well appointed, with those uncomfortable designer chairs and abstract art that seems mandatory in private healthcare facilities. I remember my first impression being that everything seemed slightly off, but in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The medical equipment was top tier, higher quality than the teaching hospital where I trained. The monitoring systems were cutting edge, yet there was an emptiness to the place, an absence of the normal indicators of a functioning medical practice. No health education posters, no magazines in the waiting area, no photos of the medical team or credentials displayed, just sterile walls and an unnatural silence. The clinic director, Dr. Reynolds, though I later discovered that wasn't his real name, gave me a brief tour that first evening. He explained that Wellness Solutions specialized in aesthetic procedures for discerning international clients who value privacy. The explanation made enough sense. Plenty of wealthy people fly in for cosmetic surgery they don't want their social circles knowing about. He showed me the recovery rooms where patients would be sleeping, the monitoring station where I'd be based, and the basic charting system I'd use to record vital signs and medication administration. What struck me as unusual was how he explicitly instructed me never to enter the 3 operating theaters at the back of the clinic. He emphasized that they contained sensitive equipment calibrated for specific procedures, and that cleaning staff would handle those areas separately. At the time, I rationalized this as reasonable. I was hired for post-op care, not surgical assistance. My first few weekends passed uneventfully. Patients would already be in recovery when I arrived for my shift, sedated and bandaged. I'd check vital signs, administer prescribed medications, and document everything as required. Most patients were gone by morning, transferred to private recovery facilities, or, as I was told, luxury hotels where nurses would continue their care. I never saw the same patient twice. What began to unsettle me were the inconsistencies I noticed between the procedures listed in the charts and the actual conditions of the patients. A chart might indicate a routine rhinoplasty, but the patient would be heavily sedated with pain management more appropriate for major surgery. Someone listed as having undergone liposuction would have bandaging in areas that made no anatomical sense for fat removal. The medication protocols were often extreme. Immunosuppressants for cosmetic procedures, powerful antibiotics typically reserved for high-risk infections. Even more disturbing were the patient demographics. Despite the clinic supposedly catering to wealthy clients, many appeared malnourished or showed signs of long-term health neglect. Some had older surgical scars that looked nothing like professional medical work. Few had proper preoperative assessment documentation. When I cautiously questioned Dr. Reynolds about these discrepancies, he dismissed my concerns with vague references to international medical standards and reminded me that discretion was part of what I was being paid for. The turning point came about 2 months into my employment. I'd arrived for my usual shift to find the clinic unusually active for a Friday evening. Typically, surgeries were completed and patients settled before I arrived at 11 p.m. But that night, there were staff I'd never seen before, moving equipment and speaking in hushed tones. Dr. Reynolds informed me that they were preparing for a special case and that I should focus on the recovery rooms at the front of the clinic. Around midnight, curiosity got the better of me. The unusual activity had died down, and the clinic had returned to its characteristic silence. I decided to check the supply room near the restricted operating theaters, telling myself I needed to restock my cart, though in truth, I wanted to glimpse whatever special case had caused such disruption to the normal routine. As I approached the back hallway, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small room adjacent to Operating Theatre 1, its door slightly ajar. Inside was what appeared to be a sophisticated control room, with multiple monitors, broadcasting equipment, and what looked like payment processing terminals. One screen displayed what was unmistakably the interior of the operating theatre next door, currently empty but fully prepped for a procedure. Another monitor showed what appeared to be a chat room or forum, with usernames I didn't recognize and messages in multiple languages. A third displayed a countdown timer, 00:37:14. Beside it was a cryptocurrency transaction log, amounts updating in real time next to usernames. The realization hit me with physical force. This wasn't just a private clinic performing discreet cosmetic surgery. This was a broadcasting studio, streaming live surgical procedures to paying viewers on the dark web. The international clients weren't the patients, they were the audience. As this horrific understanding washed over me, I heard footsteps approaching. I slipped into a nearby linen closet, heart pounding so loudly I was certain it would give me away. Through the slats in the door, I watched as Dr. Reynolds and 2 men in surgical attire wheeled a gurney toward Operating Theatre 1. The person on the gurney was conscious, but clearly terrified, attempting to move despite being partially restrained, making muffled sounds of distress through what appeared to be a medical-grade mouth covering. What happened next shifted my understanding of horror permanently. Dr. Reynolds paused by the control room, checking the monitors while explaining something to his companions. I caught fragments about viewer requests and premium packages and interactive options. One of the men adjusted a small earpiece and nodded toward the countdown timer, which now read 00:29:43. They continued into the operating theatre, but not before I glimpsed the surgical tools laid out on trays beside the operating table. These weren't standard surgical instruments for any legitimate procedure I'd studied. Some I recognized from my training as being historically used in amputations or rarely performed surgeries. Others appeared modified, designed for purposes I couldn't and didn't want to imagine. I remained frozen in that linen closet, terrified of discovery, yet unable to leave without potentially being seen. Through the closet slats, I could see into the control room, where one of the monitors now showed the interior of Operating Theatre 1. The patient was being prepped, cameras adjusted for optimal viewing angles. Text appeared at the bottom of the screen, which I realized with growing nausea were viewer comments and requests being transmitted to the surgical team's earpieces. When the actual procedure began, I had to physically press my hand against my mouth to prevent any sound from escaping. What I witnessed wasn't surgery in any medical sense. It was methodical mutilation performed with clinical precision, broadcast to an audience that was actively directing aspects of the process through their payments and requests. The surgical team worked with the detached efficiency of people performing a job they'd done many times before, pausing occasionally, as if receiving new instructions through their earpieces. I don't know how long I remained in that closet, unable to look away from the monitor yet desperate to unsee everything. Eventually, my survival instinct overrode my paralysis. I needed to escape, to report what I'd discovered. But to whom? The level of sophistication I'd witnessed suggested resources and connections beyond ordinary criminal operations. If this clinic had existed for any length of time, they likely had contingencies for exactly the situation I was in. My opportunity came when an alarm from one of the recovery rooms drew the attention of the staff member monitoring the control room. As he left to investigate, I slipped out of the closet and made my way toward the emergency exit, abandoning my belongings at the monitoring station where I should have been working. Just as I reached the exit, a hand gripped my arm. One of the surgical assistants I'd glimpsed earlier stood there, surgical mask pulled down to reveal a face that showed no surprise at finding me there. His expression wasn't angry or threatening. It was evaluating, calculating, as if I were a mathematical problem requiring solution. He explained in a conversational tone that I had witnessed their premium service, where select clients paid exceptional sums for customized procedures on volunteer subjects. He assured me the participants were compensated appropriately for their contribution to medical research and viewer education. When I expressed obvious disbelief, he offered to show me their consent documentation and payment structures, as if this would somehow normalize what I'd seen. As he spoke, maintaining his grip on my arm, I realized with growing horror that he wasn't trying to frighten or threaten me. He was recruiting me. He described how my nursing background made me an ideal addition to their team, how the compensation would dwarf anything legitimate healthcare could offer, how my student debt could be eliminated within months. His tone was that of a corporate headhunter offering a prestigious position, not a criminal proposing I join an enterprise broadcasting torture for profit. What terrified me most wasn't the gruesome surgery I'd witnessed or even the immediate danger I was in. It was the momentary temptation I felt when he mentioned the money. For one fraction of a second, financial desperation made me consider what he was offering, and that brief weakness haunts me more than anything else about that night. I stammered something about needing time to think, trying to appear open to persuasion rather than horrified. He seemed satisfied with this, releasing my arm, but informing me that leaving immediately would appear suspicious to the others. He suggested I return to my monitoring station and complete my shift as normal. We could discuss terms tomorrow. After all, he pointed out, I was already involved simply by working there. I nodded, walking steadily back to my station while my mind raced through escape scenarios. Once there, I pretended to continue my work while surreptitiously gathering only what I absolutely needed: my phone, keys, and ID. I waited until I heard the operating theatre doors open, signaling the procedure had concluded. In the momentary commotion of post-operative activity, I slipped out through a side entrance used for supply deliveries. I ran without direction at first, simply needing to put distance between myself and that building. Eventually, I found myself at a 24-hour cafe where I tried to organize my thoughts and consider my options. Going to the police seemed obvious. But what evidence did I have beyond my testimony? I'd taken nothing from the clinic, no recordings, no patient information, nothing that could corroborate my account. And if this operation had the resources I suspected, how confident could I be that local law enforcement wasn't already compromised? In the end, I submitted an anonymous tip to both the Metropolitan Police and a medical regulatory body, providing the clinic's address and a brief description of what I'd witnessed. Then I withdrew from nursing school, emptied my meager bank account, and fled to my cousin's home in Edinburgh, where I remained for months, jumping at shadows and checking over my shoulder constantly. I learned later through news reports that Wellness Solutions had been permanently closed due to zoning violations. Less than a week after my escape, there was no mention of arrests, no investigation reported in the media. The building was quickly renovated and reopened as luxury apartments within months. When I finally worked up the courage to look into Dr. Reynolds, I discovered no medical professional by that name existed in any UK registry. 3 years later, I've rebuilt some semblance of a normal life. I completed my nursing degree at a different university and now work in pediatrics in a small community hospital, about as far from private aesthetic clinics as possible. I've moved multiple times, changed my phone number, deleted all social media. Normal precautions, I tell myself, though part of me knows they're probably unnecessary. If they wanted to find me, they likely could have by now. Sometimes I wonder if Wellness Solutions was unique or just one node in a larger network. How many other abandoned buildings or legitimate-seeming medical facilities house similar operations? How many other desperate students or healthcare workers have been drawn into that world, either knowingly or, like me, discovering the truth too late? I still receive emails occasionally from temporary healthcare staffing apps, listing private clinics seeking weekend help. Some offer remarkably generous compensation for simple overnight monitoring. I delete them immediately, but before I do, I sometimes find myself looking at the addresses, wondering how many other viewing rooms exist behind unremarkable facades, how many other special cases are broadcast to audiences willing to pay premium rates for custom modifications to unwilling bodies. The most disturbing thought, the one that keeps me awake some nights, is wondering about those viewers, thousands of them, based on the counter I saw that night. People sitting at ordinary computers in ordinary homes, watching the unthinkable while perhaps sipping coffee or eating dinner. People who might be my neighbors, my colleagues, my patients' parents. People who look completely normal, but who feed a marketplace that transforms human suffering into entertainment at the right price. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if somewhere out there, someone is watching me through their screen, waiting for a performance they've already paid to enjoy.